one of the highest ranking members of the Tennessee Department of Correction, was declared deceased.
Why is my mama not alive anymore, and who is responsible for this?
He's on the loose. This is a manhunt.
There's somebody in my yard, just outside my backyard.
It wasn't until then that I realized my mom is not here.
Morning, Trinity. I'm doing good, thanks. I'm just prepping for a big conference call later.
My mother, Deborah K. Johnson, started her career in the correctional facility around 1981. She was out of college from Tennessee State University and had a degree in criminal justice. She started off at the bottom as a correctional officer. She loved what she did, and she climbed that ladder like Pac-Man, just kept eating up the steps. Over a course of 36 years, not only has she been the first black female deputy warden, been the first black female warden, she had climbed to where she was a correctional administrator, which allowed her to oversee the wardens of the prisons in Tennessee.
Okay, I'll see you later. Bye-bye.
I understand why Mom was so strict on us and why she was so disciplined, because she went to work every day and saw exactly how she did not want her kids to turn out.
It's a regular Wednesday, August 7th, 2019, but there's no sign of Deborah at work.
Sometime around 10:30 in the morning, the folks that she worked with were concerned because not only had she not physically appeared for work, but they hadn't heard from her on the phone. Something seemed very, very wrong.
The guard went to check on Deborah.
The house was on the prison grounds, but not in the confinements of the prison. So she was right outside of the fence.
She saw Deborah's car in the driveway. She knocked on the front door, did not get a response.
Deborah? Deborah, are you here? Hello?
She went in and saw Deborah was laying on the bed and she was non-responsive. Then they called for outside law enforcement.
The alarm goes off. All prisoners are locked down. There's no more movement within the prison.
Over 2,000 prisoners are confined to their cells, and a full head count is underway.
I arrived on the scene a little after 1:20 p.m. One of the highest ranking members of the Tennessee Department of Correction was declared deceased at a home on the prison grounds. I've noticed several law enforcement vehicles, several personnel in front of the house, also inside the house. I immediately requested everyone remove themselves from the home. It is now a crime scene. I walked inside the home. I saw a deceased female subject.
She's face up. Her shirt has been pulled up, and she's nude from the waist down.
She had ligature marks on her neck. I discovered a telephone cord next to her on a bed, which we believe was used to strangle her.
Everybody was just in disbelief that, someone of that standing had been brutally attacked, raped, and murdered.
I was at work and I received a call from my mom's friend. She was like, I received a message that they found your mom this morning. I said, what do you mean? She said, your mom passed.
Hey, Charnay, is everything okay?
And it's my sister Sherry. She's crying. She's like, Stan, Mama died this morning.
It's hard for me to get the words out. So all I can just say is my mom died. That's all I can get out because I'm crying. I'm trying to explain. That's all I have for them.
Race to my grandmother's house is kind of like the headquarters for the family. First person I was looking for was my sister. When we saw each other, we just hugged and we cried and we hugged and we cried. And it seemed like forever before we let each other go.
In our minds, we're playing through our heads like, oh my God, did she take her blood pressure medicine? We're playing all of the scenarios because we're thinking natural causes, right?
It was one of the worst days of my life, if not the worst day. I was in shock.
We want to know everything we can know about Deborah Johnson.
Hey, what can you tell me about the victim?
We interviewed the guard. Does she have any enemies? Has she had any problems with any inmates? Have any inmates threatened her? Just so many things you want to ask them to try to get to the bottom of it.
Deborah was 64 years old and just a very kind, well-respected person. She was known for her kindness to inmates.
They called her Queen. Hey, Queen. The Queen is on the yard. Queen is here. Queen, so she really, really enjoyed that. She treated them almost like they were her kids. Like the way that she parented us is how she parented them. It even got to the point she would volunteer me for things. I'm like, Mom, you have to really stop volunteering me. Like, I don't like doing stuff like that. Quit volunteering me.
She never thought they were bad people. No matter what they did, they could be murderers, con artists, rapists, whatever. She didn't look at them as damaged. She just looked at them as injured who could be nursed back to health.
Agent Baker continues to scour Deborah's house for evidence.
I look around the room. And then you see an inmate vest in there. You're like, well, why would this lady have an inmate vest in here?
Obviously, an inmate has been in the house.
Anytime we have a violent crime, we do a canvass in the area and attempt to discover video cameras, because video can really tell us the story. In a perfect world, you're gonna have a camera right on the house, but unfortunately, we don't live in a perfect world. That doesn't happen. At a prison, your cameras are gonna be focused on, say, perimeter areas. They were designed to focus on prisoner control. There was not really any camera footage of the house per se, where the camera's showing the roads and stuff like that around that area. Yes. What do they show? We need copies of them immediately.
Every inmate on that compound was a suspect because they're inmates. On this compound, you have a maximum security area where male inmates are housed, and they are strictly behind the barbed wire fence. Inmates go through classifications as they serve their time. They either apply for or they're given an opportunity to obtain minimum trustee status.
They are on the minimum security wing. They're released to work during the day. There are no gates. This is a 6,000-acre working farm. It's normal to see inmates all day long, all over this property, moving freely.
Normally, they are not to go into a private residence without a guard escort.
The house that Deborah Johnson was in is not too far from the farm shop in the area where inmates who were granted trustee status were allowed to leave the confines of the prison.
We know that the victim was alive around 8:10 a.m. It would make sense for him to be in that area around that time. We located a vest inside the house. We were looking for this suspect without a vest on. We were reviewing footage on the main road that goes into the prison.
Rewind.
As we were reviewing the video, you see a golf cart come into focus. We know it's an inmate based on the clothing they're wearing. Well, it's not uncommon to see the prisoners driving these.
Play it again.
All inmates who are assigned to work outside,
Freeze it.
they are required to wear some sort of safety vest.
Zoom in.
The one thing you cannot see is that fluorescent vest. We have a prisoner vest inside the home of a homicide victim, and this person is driving away from that house in a cart without a vest on somewhere between 8:30 and 9. So that's huge for us because we know she was alive at 8:10, and he's seen in this area between 8:30 and 9. So I'm thinking, it's probably gonna be our guy.
You know that guy?
We learn that the inmate's name is Curtis Watson. This person was a trustee, but he was a violent person. Mr. Watson has been incarcerated for quite some time for aggravated kidnapping, aggravated assault, very serious violent crimes. He had a few more years until he completed his sentence. And we're like, all right, we've got our guy. What does he do next?
Zoom in. He's talking to a prison guard.
You see them stop and have some sort of interaction. Then you see the vehicles proceed on the same direction they had originally been on in the first place. We looked at all the available footage on the prison grounds of cars coming and going, and unfortunately, we just never saw him anymore. We can identify that guard he had the interactions with.
I'm gonna need to speak with him.
We can talk to that person and hopefully find out more.
The prison head count is now complete. It confirms Curtis Watson is missing.
We know he's got a prior violent felony conviction. We know he's been in Deborah Johnson's house. We know she's been murdered.
That's our guy.
Where is Curtis Watson?
Special Agent Baker interviews the prison guard seen on CCTV.
The prison guard that stopped him just gave a statement saying, hey, he noticed the prisoner without a vest on. He also asked him what he was doing at the time, where he was going. He said, hey, I had to fix something over at this house, and then I was moving along. That's what he's known for, so it really didn't raise any red flags. He tried to correct his behavior. This is what you need to do. You need to get another vest. You need to go on your assignment, and that's it.
Detective Baker heads to the mechanic shop to find out where Watson went next.
Good afternoon. Agent Chuck Baker. Need to ask you some questions about Curtis Watson's movements this morning.
He goes back to the workshop, gets another vest.
He asked permission from a guard to leave the mechanic shop, stating that he had to recover some parts, and then he hops on the tractor, leaves.
Excuse me 1 second. Baker.
We received a call that a missing tractor had been found in a field east of the prison grounds, approximately 2 miles away from where the homicide occurred. Also found at the scene was a ID of Curtis Watson. That right there was the game changer. It was like, all right, not only do we have an escaped inmate, but is this escaped inmate the person responsible for the death of this lady?
Obviously, you know, whenever you have an escaped inmate, they're in survival mode and desperate.
It may be likely that the first contact with Curtis Watson might be made by some member of the public. It's going to be very important to law enforcement to get this information out.
In Tennessee, we have what's called the Blue Alert system. This is very similar to the Amber Alert system. A Blue Alert is where a law enforcement officer has either been seriously injured or killed in the line of duty. We issued the third Blue Alert in history of the state of Tennessee for the killer of Deborah Johnson.
Everybody's phone got those alerts, those screeching sounds. Usually when you hear there's a hurricane, there's a tornado.
Oh my God.
And when you read the alert, they was looking for the guy who killed my mom.
The family now know the truth. Deborah did not die from natural causes.
I'm just thinking, how did somebody get to her? Why wasn't nobody there to help her? Like, what did you do to my mama? Like, why is my mama not alive anymore? And who is responsible for this?
The killer's on the run.
At that moment, when I realized that she had been murdered, I'm thinking he rode off into the sunset on a tractor nonetheless. Do you know how slow tractors are? And he was able to ride off and live his life after murdering my mom. So in that moment, I was scared. I did not know where he was, what his motives were, who he was coming after next. We know that he was capable of doing this to my mom, then I'm sure he's capable of doing it again.
This is a large area, several hundred acres. If he was able, he could disappear in the woods for weeks.
We've had inmates that have escaped from West Tennessee Penitentiary that we didn't capture for years after.
We've had 0 sightings of this guy. We haven't seen him running through a field. No one's seen him going to a store. No one's seen him going into a barn. No one's seen him, period.
The longer that someone is missing, the harder they are to catch.
He's on the loose. You're worried about him committing another murder.
We believe he's heading east because east is really the only way away from the Mississippi River to basically civilization.
A blue alert is out right now for this guy, Curtis Watson.
We were pushing out his identity, his photograph, and reward money for his capture in an effort to get as much information out there as we could.
The TBI released these photos showing him just minutes before his escape.
Not only is it an escape, it's also a homicide. The media was all over this. It went nationwide instantly. I believe it even went worldwide.
Hundreds of law enforcement personnel are drafted in to track Watson down.
Troopers threw up checkpoints all across Lauderdale County, all after what the TBI says was the murder of prison official Deborah Johnson.
At a number of the intersections to Highway 51 and some of these country roads, they were interviewing the occupants of the car, checking to see if anybody was in the back seat. They were also checking that they weren't being controlled or otherwise threatened. And I do believe they were checking trunks to make sure that nobody was hidden in any of these vehicles.
Did he get in a car? You know, did he find a motorcycle at a hunting camp? Did he find a four-wheeler?
Investigators want to find out if Watson escaped the area earlier by car. There is only one main road close to the penitentiary, Tennessee State Route 87.
All the visitors, deliveries, so on, they have to go down this road. We're in a rural area, and the one thing we see more and more of every single day are residential cameras. Find every camera, find every bit of footage, let's review it and see what we can find.
They were checking every possible camera. Unfortunately, in a rural area, in a small town, you will see outside cameras, but then you go in to ask them to view it, and either it's not operational, it records over, like they don't maintain the footage, or it's a deterrent, but they don't record the footage.
Every once in a while, though, you get a home run and you find what you're looking for.
Baker finds a camera directly overlooking Route 87.
You'll pull that footage up.
He cues the footage up to just after 9 a.m.
We're hoping that this person is going to come into view.
Rewind. Freeze it. Zoom in.
We were kind of, you know, at the mercy of the technology. Unless you're focused in on a driver, you're never going to see who's driving, especially in a moving vehicle.
Freeze it. Zoom in.
You might be able to determine whether it be a male or female, possibly, but it's still very difficult. Unfortunately, it really doesn't help us. There was just nothing there that was suspicious.
The apprehension of any suspect is very important. You're worried that what is likely to happen will be bad. We believe he's willing to do anything, including harm one or more people, to continue his efforts to escape detection and arrest. So his motivation level to commit other crimes is very high. You've had hundreds of officers working in shifts, and they're doing something that they're not really used to doing. This is not pulling somebody over in a patrol car. This is a manhunt.
It's a wild goose chase to some extent. You're looking for a needle in a haystack.
The THP checkpoints will remain in place throughout Lauderdale County throughout the night.
They were working 24-hour days on very little sleep.
And it was hot, and it was muggy, and there were bugs everywhere. This went on for days.
More than 24 hours, and there is still no sign of an inmate who escaped the West Tennessee State Penitentiary.
The longer that you're in this intense search mode with this amount of manpower, every day that you don't have a conclusion is disappointing.
I didn't know how long it was going to continue, right? At the day one, you're thinking, oh, God, they can't find him. Like, how can you not find a prisoner? I would literally sleep with a gun on my nightstand. I tried not to watch the media. I didn't want to see my mom's picture on the screen. I didn't want to see his picture because I was upset.
I felt like I was in the middle of a movie. You have an escaped convict. He's on the run, and everybody's looking for him. It's just like, this can't be life. This is not real.
I know for a fact that because it is Deborah Johnson, they're going to do everything they can to find this person and bring this person to justice. And I truly did believe that. Like, it's Deborah.
Where's your emergency?
There's somebody in my house, in my yard, just outside my bedroom.
A 911 call comes from a Henning resident. It says, hey, I've been notified by my camera, and I'm looking on camera, and there's a guy who I believe to be the suspect in this standing in my carport next to my refrigerator. I'm an hour and a half away. So we have agents who happen to luckily be there. They're on the scene very quickly.
By the time law enforcement arrive, the man has gone.
I arrived on the scene. The first thing I want to do is see the video.
Play it again.
It shows a guy in the garage wearing camouflage clothing and his camouflage hat, carrying a backpack.
Can you play your second camera, please? Play it again.
He goes up to the refrigerator.
Freeze it.
You get to see his beard kind of in contrast to that white vehicle behind him.
Play it again.
Once he opens up the fridge, you can see the light shine on his face.
Freeze it. Can you zoom in on that frame? It's definitely Curtis Watson.
The video was that good. It was that clear. I mean, it shows Curtis Watson. Here he is, just a few miles away from where he originally escaped from. This is our first concrete lead that, hey, we have Curtis Watson spotted. We're seeing what he's wearing, what he's carrying, but really the beard, to me, the facial features, it's a match.
He was no longer in just standard prison gear. It looked like he was in survival mode. He's gotten a change of clothes to try to better suit being in the woods. He's certainly not afraid to walk up to a residence and take a chance on being captured on camera. He's having to take these risks to try to stay on the run.
Can you flip to the third camera, please?
They cue up the footage from the doorbell motion sensor camera.
Can you zoom in on that?
You can see he's clutching several items. He's in the process right here of stealing food and drink of some sort.
He's been out for several days. He's got to be hungry.
You know what he's wearing, you know what he looks like, and you know that his situation has been and still is pretty desperate. The family of this house would have been extremely concerned about the danger that he presented to them and to their neighbors.
These people carry guns. It's a very gun-friendly area. The opportunity for him to ascertain a weapon is very high. So that was one of our biggest fears, because now he's in a community. We immediately say, hey, this is it. All hands on deck. Everybody respond. Send the world. Every local agency in the area, all are responding to Henning, Tennessee.
10-4.
We had to catch him immediately, or else someone else was going to either be hurt or killed.
We couldn't really truly start to grieve and start that process of getting our thoughts together until he was caught.
This inmate has escaped. We have to find this inmate. So that's now the conversation that we have to have. And so we can't even sing my mom's praises and talk about how much of a wonderful person she was, because we're still looking for him.
My mom's gone, okay, that's something I had to deal with. But don't let anybody else have to bury their mom or dad or uncle, anything in that nature. Catch him before he harms anyone else.
911, where's your emergency? Okay, what's your location? I'm in Carolina Street in Henning, Tennessee. Okay, you have eyes on him? Yes, ma'am.
Some individuals, some Tennessee Department of Correction, had observed him in a field close by to where he was spotted on the camera. So they were able to call that in and then have law enforcement get in the area.
The stakes were high. Is this going to be a violent arrest? Is he going to attempt to flee?
Worst that could happen is that he has some type of weapon and he decides that he's going to try to go death by cop.
Does he pull out a gun? Does he start firing at civilians? Does he try to harm himself? How is this going to end? We weren't letting him leave the area. He knows that somebody could shoot him right then and there.
Curtis Watson, hands up, hands up!
We're doing what we have to do to get him into custody.
Get your hands up!
He knows he's caught. He is physically exhausted.
Hands up! Keep him up!
Once he realizes that their guns are trained on him and he cannot go anywhere, he gives up.
The handcuffs are on and he's in the back of the car.
He's got jungle rot on his feet. On every inch of his body, there's a mosquito bite. He is nasty. I'm looking at this monster. But the first thing I want to know in my head is, why did you do this? He did talk a little about the escape, kind of where he went, why he did what he did, things like that. But we never talked about the homicide of Miss Johnson. He refuses to talk about that.
Without a confession, authorities turned to the DNA evidence.
We were not able to recover any DNA from the vest. There was an additional search in this mechanic shop, and that's when they discovered Curtis Watson's boxers in the trash can.
He clearly believed that these were incriminating. As it turned out, they were. They contained some of his DNA, which was consistent with DNA that was found on the rape kit that was taken from Deborah Johnson.
Okay. Thank you for letting us know. You caught him.
It was a rare, happy moment for us as a family to be able to say, okay, well, at least we got the bastard who did this.
It gave us a sense of relief. Even though we were grieving, we were hurting, we knew we had each other.
I'm shaking. I realize even though the tears aren't coming, my body naturally is telling me this is traumatizing. It wasn't until then that I realized my mom is not here.
A week later, Deborah Johnson is laid to rest. An honorary convoy of police vehicles escort her.
My mother's funeral, it's unforgettable. She would have really felt appreciated, honored, and unworthy of all the praise that she got.
I knew she was gonna bring a lot of people out. My family members were shocked because she was so unassuming if you knew her. You wouldn't believe that she was so big.
She was very much loved, respected across the state of Tennessee by everybody she dealt with and everybody she touched.
It was like the little things that really, really hurt. Having to pick out her dress to wear in the funeral. Picking out the arrangement for on top of the casket. I wanted it to flow over the casket so I would feel like she's draped in flowers. And how the small details mattered. She would leave notes in my lunchbox. How the small details mattered. And so for me, it mattered what color we had on. It mattered that we all had purple flowers on. I wanted her to feel that she was loved because we felt that, you know?
In June 2021, Curtis Watson pleads guilty to rape and first-degree murder.
He left his housing unit that morning to go to work. He then arrived at his workshop, got on his vehicle, drove over to Miss Johnson's home.
The fight began at that point. I do believe that Deborah fought for her life. Whatever triggered him, only Curtis Watson knows the answer to that. After he had raped and murdered Deborah Johnson, Curtis Watson was getting rid of what he thought might be DNA evidence. He gets back on the golf cart.
He then left the area. We see him on the video camera meet up with the guard. He goes back to the workshop, changes some clothing, then again leaves the area on a tractor. The tractor is then later found 2 miles away, abandoned. And then the last time he's seen is 2 miles away on the video in Henning, Tennessee.
Curtis Watson is sentenced to life without parole.
It was a terrible crime. But I was glad that we, as an agency and our partners on the outside, were able to bring this person to justice, and he's going to sit in prison till the day he dies.
My Facebook status says, I'm Deborah's child, so you know how I am.
I'm a public school teacher. My sister is a nurse, and my younger brother is an assistant principal. So we all are in that public servant life for profession because of the upbringing we had through our mother. And I think that's just how God created her.
When I think about her, it's strength, it's consistency, it's love, it's equity, it's fairness. And hopefully I can be those things as I move forward and be as successful as she's been.
Tennessee Prison for Women.
The sweltering midsummer heat of Atlanta, Georgia, in July 1999 carried a thick, oppressive humidity, but it was nothing compared to the ice-cold dread that paralyzed the quiet suburban neighborhood of Buckhead on the night 24-year-old brilliant medical researcher Valerie Jenkins vanished without a single trace. Her modern townhouse sat perfectly undisturbed beneath the canopy of ancient oak trees, the front door locked from the inside, the air conditioning humming its monotonous tune, and a porcelain mug of freshly brewed chamomile tea sitting cooling on the kitchen counter next to her open biology textbooks. There were no signs of forced entry, no shattered glass glinting under the hallway lights, and no blood splatters on the pristine hardwood floors, creating an eerie, impossible vacuum that suggested she had either stepped out willingly with someone she trusted implicitly or had been swallowed whole by the shadows. Within hours, the frantic flashing blue lights of the Atlanta Police Department cordoned off the entire block, but every canine tracking line died at the edge of her manicured driveway. Every initial neighborhood canvas led directly into a brick wall, and the terrifying disappearance rapidly curdled into a permanent urban nightmare. Weeks dragged into agonizing months, and despite a massive mobilization of state investigators, the deployment of federal task forces, and thousands of public tips, the trail systematically eroded into a maddening, total silence that lasted for over 27 years. Generations of detectives inherited the weathered cardboard boxes of the Jenkins file, staring helplessly at the grainy photographs of the smiling young woman, completely blind to the fact that the horrifying answer to the mystery was buried less than 3 miles away, trapped beneath the reinforced concrete floorboards of an ordinary, unassuming colonial home. The initial response from local authorities back in 1999 was a chaotic blitz of yellow crime scene tape and tracking dogs, but the absolute lack of a struggle at the residence completely paralyzed the early momentum of the homicide division. Detectives focused almost exclusively on the theory of a highly organized stalker or an obsessive colleague from the university research laboratory, blindly missing the subtle anomaly that Valerie's personal calendar had a missing page torn clean from the spiral spine on the exact date of her disappearance. A nearby delivery driver recalled seeing a nondescript white utility van with faded commercial markings idling near the cul-de-sac around midnight, but the detail was brushed aside as a routine municipal maintenance vehicle, a fatal oversight that would protect a monster for nearly 3 decades. As the years turned into decades, the case file became a historical graveyard of dead-end leads, false confessions from attention-seeking convicts, and devastating dead ends that left Valerie's aging parent shattered, trapped in a perpetual state of frozen grief. The local news media, which had initially fueled a frenzy of front-page headlines demanding immediate answers, gradually shifted its focus to the rising crime waves of the new millennium, leaving the Jenkins file to languish on a forgotten shelf in the dark basement archives. The terrifying uncertainty became a permanent scar on the city's collective memory, a quiet, throbbing ache that reminded everyone that a young woman had been stolen from her sanctuary and the beast responsible was still breathing the clean Georgia air. For nearly 3 decades, the dark secret remained buried deep within the suburban landscape, protected by the passage of time, the fading memories of aging witnesses, and the limitations of 20th-century forensic search methods. The turn of the century arrived with dizzying technological promises, yet the ancient, unindexed property deeds and structural construction permits of the Buckhead district remained locked in dusty city hall filing cabinets, unread and unverified. It wasn't until early 2026 that a specialized cold case task force, armed with a revolutionary forensic scanning technique known as subterranean quantum thermal georadar, began systematically remapping the older residential sectors of Atlanta to look for structural anomalies beneath the earth. This breakthrough technology did not merely scan superficial soil layers, it was capable of penetrating deep beneath solid masonry, detecting hidden cavities, sealed chambers, and unnatural voids that had been written off as solid ground for generations. When the advanced algorithm processed the remastered thermal profiles of an abandoned property on Peachtree Road, it did not return a standard plumbing network or a routine storm drain. Instead, the system triggered a catastrophic red alert anomaly that mapped a perfectly rectangular, reinforced concrete bunker hidden beneath a false basement wall. The realization hit the modern task force like a physical blow. They had stumbled upon a highly secure, subterranean vault that had been deliberately omitted from all city construction blueprints since 1999. The focus of the clandestine investigation shifted instantly from an archival search into a terrifying, high-stakes forensic excavation as federal agents, specialized anthropologists, and industrial drilling teams swarmed the quiet residential property under the cover of a standard utility emergency. They discovered that in July 1999, the property had been owned by a highly eccentric, reclusive structural engineer named Arthur Vance, who had served as a freelance consultant for the university's biomedical facility, where Valerie conducted her research. His official business ledgers from that fateful summer revealed a chilling, unexplained purchase of medical-grade restraint hardware, heavy soundproofing insulation, and hundreds of pounds of industrial quickset concrete, transactions that had been hidden beneath a web of corporate shell names. Modern digital mapping of Vance's historical movements revealed that his utility van matched the exact specifications of the vehicle seen idling near Valerie's cul-de-sac, an authoritative presence that allowed him to approach her perimeter without raising an immediate neighborhood alarm. The horrifying truth began to crystallize. Vance had utilized his engineering expertise to build a private, subterranean prison, intercepting Valerie under the cover of darkness and transporting her down into the reinforced concrete vault where he could execute his twisted desires without a single scream reaching the outside world. The breakthrough exhumation was executed with absolute precision on a quiet Tuesday morning as tactical teams breached the heavy steel blast doors discovered behind the false masonry of the old basement workshop. Inside the dark, stagnant atmosphere of the subterranean vault, which had remained hermetically sealed for 27 years, modern investigators were confronted with a clinical, terrifying time capsule of the original crime. The space was furnished like a twisted imitation of a hospital room, equipped with heavy iron restraints anchored directly into the solid concrete foundation, fading surveillance monitors, and a stark collection of preserved medical artifacts from the late 90s. At the far corner of the reinforced chamber, beneath a cracked, poorly poured secondary layer of industrial concrete, the ground-penetrating radar confirmed the presence of human skeletal remains, completely preserved by the unique, airtight chemistry of the sealed bunker. The discovery sent an immediate shockwave through the Atlanta Police Department, instantly ending the 27-year mystery of Valerie's disappearance and transforming the abandoned suburban home into a horrific house of horrors that dominated national news lines. As forensic technicians worked around the clock inside the subterranean vault, utilizing delicate trowels and advanced molecular brushes to extract the skeletal remains from the concrete matrix, the state's behavioral analysis unit began a total reconstruction of Vance's psychological profile. They discovered that the killer had lived a flawless double life, operating as a highly respected, quiet municipal consultant by day while maintaining an absolute, predatory control over his hidden subterranean kingdom by night. Vance had passed away in 2018 from natural causes, taking the secret of his hidden bunker to the grave, entirely convinced that his engineering brilliance had allowed him to execute the perfect crime. He had spent his final decades walking the very streets of Buckhead, interacting with local business owners, and watching the police department scramble for leads, entirely insulated from suspicion by his quiet, unassuming professional facade. The recovery of the physical evidence inside the concrete vault proved that Valerie had fought her captor with an unimaginable, desperate fury, leaving deep scratching marks on the interior steel doors and a microscopic trace of foreign material locked inside the airtight seams of the chamber. The legal and forensic communities recognized that this discovery would reshape the methodology of cold case investigations across the United States, proving that the answers to long-standing missing persons files are often hidden within the very geography of the original target sectors. Outside the barricaded Peachtree Road property, public outrage and collective grief intensified, with local residents gathering to place flowers, candles, and photographs of Valerie beneath the ancient oak trees that had witnessed her era. The city was suddenly forced to re-examine every unresolved disappearance from the late 90s through a warped, terrifying lens of total vulnerability, wondering how many other subterranean chambers were hidden beneath the manicured lawns of their own neighborhoods. The dynamic metropolis that had spent 27 years looking at Valerie Jenkins' faded missing posters with a sense of helpless sorrow was now forced to confront the concrete reality of her suffering, listening to the hollow, rhythmic echo of the jackhammers breaking through the stone that had kept her silent for so long. Inside the Regional Molecular Identification Laboratory, technicians utilized next-generation DNA amplification to cross-validate the skeletal remains, matching the genetic material extracted from the deep bone matrix directly with the preserved reference samples held by the Jenkins family since 1999. The molecular profile was an absolute, undeniable match, providing a grim, definitive closure that shattered the agonizing limbo of her surviving relatives, but opening a dark, administrative investigation into why the property had been overlooked during the initial searches. The physical evidence recovered from the subterranean vault was a silent, unyielding witness from the past, a voice from the concrete grave that was slowly but surely piecing together the final, terrifying hours of a brilliant young researcher whose life had been systematically stolen by a predator hiding behind a consultant's blueprints. The narrative of a cold case frozen in time had been permanently demolished, replaced by the clinical, Dawn-Dap reality of a forensic triumph that proved the passage of time can never truly bury the truth when the earth itself is forced to yield its darkest secrets. As the formal investigation drew toward its conclusion, the task force prepared to release a comprehensive administrative report detailing a chilling collection of personal journals recovered from a hidden compartment inside Vance's old basement workshop. These journals, written in a tight, precise engineering script on yellowed grid paper, read like an operational construction manual for human captivity, detailing the exact structural specifications, sound decibel calculations, and ventilation requirements necessary to maintain a permanent subterranean occlusion. The notes revealed that Vance had tracked Valerie's daily routines for over 6 months, mapping her study hours, her running routes, and the security vulnerabilities of her townhouse with a cold, mathematical malice that left seasoned homicide detectives visibly shaken. The state argued that the journals proved the abduction was an act of supreme, premeditated depravity, an engineering project dedicated to the total erasure of a human being's freedom. The revelation of the hidden journals transformed the final phase of the investigation into a deep, collective institutional trauma for the city of Atlanta, forcing local real estate bureaus and municipal mapping divisions to implement mandatory subsurface radar screening for all older historical properties undergoing transfer or renovation. The structural trust of the community had been permanently altered, replaced by a cold, permeating awareness that the ordinary colonial houses lining their suburban streets could hold dark, subterranean secrets completely invisible from the surface. The dynamic city stood in a state of quiet, solemn reflection as the final transport vehicles removed the physical remnants of the Buckhead House of Horrors, closing the book on an administrative mystery that had lasted for 27 years. The ghost of Valerie Jenkins had finally broken through the reinforced concrete walls of her hidden prison, stripping the mask of anonymity from her deceased captor and forcing the world to confront the absolute, undeniable truth of her story, while the community she left behind watched in breathless, trembling awe as the light of justice finally illuminated the darkness beneath their feet. The unsealing of Arthur Vance's subterranean fortress did not merely close a historical file, it initiated a violent, psychological collapse within the structural history of the Buckhead community. As the early morning light of July 3, 2026, filtered through the dense Georgia pines surrounding the Peachtree Road property, the true, agonizing logistics of Valerie Jenkins' 27-year erasure began to emerge from the damp clay. The initial public relief of finding a missing daughter rapidly curdled into a deep, systemic horror as federal forensic teams, clad in white biohazard suits, began a meticulous, millimeter-by-millimeter extraction process inside the concrete vault. The national media infrastructure had completely encamped along the suburban boulevard, their high-intensity broadcast towers casting long, unnatural shadows over the very streets Arthur Vance had walked as a free man for decades. Inside the command trailer of the FBI's Behavioral Sciences and Evidence Response Team, investigators sat in a heavy, paralyzed silence, staring at the freshly digitized blueprints of a residential basement that had been transformed into a cold, engineering blueprint for human subjugation. The primary operational objective of the Federal Forensic Task Force was to systematically reconstruct the physical timeline of July 14, 1999, utilizing modern digital physics to extract unassailable truths from a crime scene that had been hermetically preserved in stone. Technicians deployed high-intensity three-dimensional laser scanners inside the subterranean chamber, capturing the precise spatial layout of the restraint mechanisms, the ventilation intake ports, and the structural density of the secondary concrete pour that held Valerie's remains. This digital exhumation revealed a terrifying reality. The subterranean vault was not a crude, makeshift hiding spot dug out in a sudden panic. It was a highly sophisticated, structurally reinforced isolation bunker that had required months of meticulous excavation, masonry work, and electrical engineering before the abduction ever took place. To map the absolute premeditation of the crime, investigators began a deep-dive forensic audit of local hardware supply registries, industrial concrete distribution logs, and legacy municipal utility invoices from the spring of 1999. Because Arthur Vance operated as a high-level freelance structural consultant for the university's biomedical expansion project, he possessed the unique, unrestricted clearance to order heavy building materials without triggering standard commercial red flags. The recovered paper trail, pulled from obsolete microfilm archives in downtown Atlanta, showed that between March and June of 1999, Vance had systematically routed over 4 tons of high-strength industrial concrete and specialized military-grade soundproofing sheets through a network of defunct corporate shell companies. These materials were delivered directly to his residential address under the guise of a routine foundation repair project, a tactical maneuver that completely blinded his neighbors and local building inspectors to the construction of a human cage beneath his workshop. The data presented on the task force's tactical monitors showed that Vance had even manipulated the residential electrical grid to sustain his hidden kingdom without causing suspicious spikes in power consumption. Forensic engineers discovered that he had tapped directly into a primary municipal conduit running adjacent to the Peachtree Road property line, bypassing his house's main meter entirely to power a dedicated, independent ventilation and surveillance matrix inside the vault. This illegal, high-voltage tap had remained undetected by utility companies for nearly 3 decades, buried beneath 6 feet of packed Georgia red clay and reinforced steel conduit piping. The sheer complexity of the infrastructure proved that Vance had utilized his professional expertise to construct a perfect administrative blind spot, a self-sustaining zone of absolute control where he could hold a human being entirely outside the civilized world. The physical exhumation of the skeletal remains from the concrete matrix required an extraordinary level of delicate, surgical precision that pushed the boundaries of modern forensic anthropology. Dr. Helena Rossi, the chief medical examiner leading the recovery team, took the witness stand at an emergency administrative hearing in downtown Atlanta, displaying a series of high-resolution, color-coded radiological scans of the secondary concrete layer. Because the concrete pour was executed in a confined, high-humidity environment, the chemical curing process trapped microscopic air pockets and specific mineral crystallization patterns that tell an undeniable story, Dr. Rossi explained to the panel of investigators. Valerie Jenkins did not pass away peacefully inside that vault. The physical trauma markers on the skeletal remains, specifically the defensive compression fractures along the metacarpal bones and the severe microfissures in the enamel of her teeth, prove that she was subjected to a prolonged, agonizing struggle against her restraint architecture before she was permanently entombed in the masonry. The courtroom fell into an absolute, breathless paralysis as Dr. Rossi displayed a series of macro photographs isolating the deep interior margins of the concrete pour that had direct contact with the victim's clothing. The unique, high-strength chemical matrix of the industrial cement had effectively acted as a perfect mold, preserving the precise structural weave, button configurations, and localized fabric tears of the blouse Valerie had worn on the night she vanished from her Buckhead townhouse. This physical impression was a silent, unyielding echo from 1999, a biological and mechanical timestamp that allowed investigators to determine that she had been forcibly pinned down into the wet concrete mixture while still wearing her personal garments, proving that her entombment was an active, deliberate execution designed to eliminate any possibility of a superficial forensic recovery if the house was ever searched with standard police K-9 units. The psychological profile compiled by federal behavioral analysts during the excavation painted a terrifying picture of an apex predator who derived an intense, secondary gratification from maintaining absolute visual proximity to his crime for the remainder of his natural life. Archival municipal work orders revealed that throughout the early 2000s, Vance had repeatedly volunteered to assist the Buckhead Neighborhood Watch and local civic planning committees, actively positioning himself as a reliable, quiet voice for community security and property preservation. He had attended the candlelit vigils held for Valerie on the anniversaries of her disappearance, standing quietly at the back of the crowd beneath the ancient oak trees, listening to her family's desperate pleas for information, while the physical evidence of his depravity was actively buried beneath his own feet just 3 miles away. This layer of calculated, chilling theater allowed him to monitor the family's private interactions with private investigators and ensure that no structural utility works would ever pass through the coordinates of his hidden subterranean installation. The modern breakthrough that shattered this 27-year administrative lie was anchored in the field of advanced subterranean quantum thermal georadar, a science that transformed the invisible density variations of the Earth into an absolute death warrant for Vance's historical legacy. The technology, developed primarily for deep-crust military bunker detection, utilized high-frequency quantum wave packets to map the specific thermal and molecular friction signatures of materials buried deep beneath solid concrete foundations. When the specialized task force scanned the basement workshop of the Peachtree Road house, the quantum georadar did not merely detect a hollow space. It mapped the precise density contrast between the old, native 1950s residential foundation and the dense, high-strength industrial pour executed by Vance in the summer of 1999. The difference was as clear as ink on white paper, exposing a massive, unnatural distortion in the Earth that no conventional radar or superficial police search could have ever revealed. The defense table for the estate of Arthur Vance, now represented by corporate executors and legacy insurance lawyers attempting to shield his massive property assets from total civil forfeiture, looked visibly decimated by the depth of the molecular and spatial validation. The state had established a seamless chain of structural evidence that left no room for alternative explanations, proving that the house itself was an active instrument of a prolonged, fatal kidnapping. At the defense podium, the estate's legal counsel attempted to insert a desperate narrative of doubt, suggesting that the subterranean vault could have been constructed by previous owners or used by transient workers without Vance's direct knowledge during his frequent professional travels out of state. The property remained vacant for long stretches during the summer of 1999 while my client was consulting on interstate biomedical projects, the attorney argued, his voice rising in an attempt to deflect the financial liability of the estate. We cannot definitively prove that Arthur Vance was the individual who operated the mechanical restraint switches inside that room. But Assistant District Attorney Marcus Vance stood up with an immediate, Don-Dap counterargument that permanently locked the deceased consultant within the perimeter of his own trophy bunker. The prosecutor produced a single plastic evidence bag containing a beautifully preserved, gold-plated mechanical timer switch that had been extracted from the main control panel behind the false basement wall. The internal wiring of the timer device featured a highly specialized, proprietary soldering technique used exclusively by industrial structural engineers specializing in biomedical cleanroom automation, the exact, unique technical signature that Vance had taught as a guest lecturer at the university facility in the late 90s. Furthermore, a microscopic trace of skin tissue locked inside the heavy dial mechanism was processed through rapid DNA amplification, returning an absolute, unassailable match for Vance's own genetic profile. The machine had trapped its creator. The very precision he had used to guarantee the absolute silence of the vault had left a permanent biometric anchor that completely destroyed his anonymity. Outside the heavily barricaded perimeter of the Peachtree Road property, the city of Atlanta was experiencing a profound civic and structural transformation as the realization of Vance's true nature forced local real estate bureaus and municipal mapping divisions to implement mandatory subsurface radar screening for all older properties undergoing title transfers. The collective trust of the historic Buckhead district had been permanently liquidated, replaced by a cold, permeating paranoia that left every resident looking down at the concrete floors of their own basements with a sudden, sickening sense of vulnerability. Public outrage grew dawn dap as the local media broadcasted the continuous updates from the excavation site, with thousands of citizens gathering at the perimeter lines to witness the final removal of the heavy steel blast doors that had kept Valerie Jenkins isolated from the world for 27 years. The afternoon session of the administrative inquiry concluded with a federal judge granting an absolute, sweeping asset forfeiture order against the entirety of the Vance estate, directing that his properties, investment portfolios, and legacy trusts be immediately liquidated to fund a permanent national foundation dedicated to advanced subterranean forensic research. The state indicated that the next phase of the investigation would involve the complete transcription and release of the extensive personal journals recovered from the hidden wall compartment, promising to expose the deep, calculated psychological engineering that drove the abduction from its inception. As the heavy transport vehicles carried the structural remnants of the basement workshop away from Peachtree Road under a flashing police escort, the hollow, metallic clanking of the machinery served as a grim, unyielding reminder that the walls of secrecy Vance had built with such mathematical precision had finally fallen, leaving his memory naked before the absolute vengeance of the law. The expanding forensic vortex surrounding the Buckhead estate of Arthur Vance grew increasingly dark as the third phase of the federal investigation moved past the physical recovery of the remains and plunged into the terrifying operational timeline of his structural career. The suburban landscape of Peachtree Road had been completely converted into a high-security federal command post, with armored temporary units lining the sidewalks and automated ground sensors detecting any micro-vibrations along the perimeter walls. Inside the command hub of the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, agents began pinning heavy red evidence markers onto a localized geospatial mapping grid, tracking Vance's historical engineering consultancies from 1995 to 2010. The digital visualization exposed a chilling reality. The architectural grid of the hidden subterranean bunker mirrored the exact layout of the high-security containment cleanrooms Vance had designed for corporate biomedical clients across the southeastern United States. The realization that they were analyzing a crime scene constructed with the clinical precision of an industrial quarantine facility turned the administrative inquiry into a breathless confrontation with a master level of psychopathic engineering. The prosecution's immediate objective for the afternoon session was to completely neutralize the defense estate's remaining legal arguments regarding alternative property access by establishing a flawless, microscopic link between the physical components of the vault and the private tools Vance used daily. Assistant District Attorney Marcus Vance stepped to the central podium, his physical movements rigid, presenting a newly unsealed forensic catalog detailing the extraction of secondary biological material from an item that had remained hidden inside the structural framework of the bunker's ventilation assembly. This pristine chain of custody completely bypassed the house's superficial storage spaces, effectively proving that the construction and maintenance of the life support systems inside the concrete cage were executed exclusively by the hands of the deceased consultant. To deliver this forensic cross-validation with absolute scientific precision, the state called to the stand Dr. Helena Rossi, a senior molecular geneticist from the Department of Homeland Security's Advanced Forensic Unit. Dr. Rossi displayed a series of high-magnification, color-coded electron microscope scans that isolated the structural components of the heavy industrial ventilation fan housing that had kept the underground atmosphere breathable for 27 years. Using advanced vacuum-assisted localized macromolecular extraction, our team isolated deep-layer epithelial cells embedded within the rubberized gasket seals surrounding the primary intake motor, Dr. Rossi testified, her clinical tone cutting through the dense silence of the gallery. These are high-impact transfer cells, forced into the material by intense physical compression during the manual calibration of the drive unit. The genetic markers extracted from these deep gaskets match the profile of Arthur Vance with an absolute, unassailable statistical certainty of 1 in 112 billion. The courtroom watched in absolute fixation as the data strands on the screen locked into a flawless, overlapping alignment with Vance's reference sample, leaving the estate's legal team entirely paralyzed. The state had effectively bypassed 27 years of environmental decay and corporate property transfers, utilizing the microscopic structure of the infrastructure itself to recreate the physical dynamic of the construction phase. The evidence proved that Vance hadn't just built a room and abandoned it. He had personally calibrated the environmental life support systems, his own skin cells crushed into the machinery by the brute force of his tools, leaving his biological signature stamped into the heart of the prison. Vance's corporate insurance lawyers sat perfectly still at their table, their fingers twitching in a silent rhythm that signaled the complete collapse of their defensive, financial maneuvers. The prosecution then shifted its focus from the molecular universe back to the physical Earth, exposing a chilling trail of logistical preparations that proved the abduction of Valerie Jenkins was a cold, premeditated calculation rather than a sudden, chaotic crime of opportunity. The state introduced into evidence a series of long-lost municipal infrastructure maps and department zoning surveys from June 1999, which had been recovered from a locked iron trunk in the basement workshop of the Peachtree Road residence. These maps, which Vance had checked out from the city planning archives just 4 weeks before Valerie vanished from her townhouse, featured hand-drawn annotations in fading red ink, marking the exact coordinates of the subterranean telecommunication lines and the neighborhood's local drainage conduits. The infrastructure mapping experts called by the state testified without hesitation that the tight, precise script on the margins of the maps belonged exclusively to Vance, detailing specific notes on the acoustic properties of the surrounding terrain and the visual blind spots of the area's early traffic surveillance camera arrays. One chilling notation, written adjacent to the exact coordinate of Valerie's suburban cul-de-sac, read, "Acoustic occlusion zone. Heavy canopy of ancient oaks prevents direct street lamp illumination after 2300 hours. Local telephone switching junction accessible from the main road line. Disconnection profile, clean." The presentation of this document caused a violent shudder to pass through the gallery, stripping away the last remaining illusion that the engineer had simply committed a spontaneous error. It proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that he had spent his summer months scouting the neighborhood like a military strategist, mapping the structural vulnerabilities of the environment before he ever targeted his victim. The afternoon session took a deeply emotional and destabilizing turn when the prosecution called to the stand 78-year-old Raymond Jenkins, Valerie's surviving older brother, who had spent his entire adult life running an independent, multi-generational campaign to keep his sister's memory alive in the public consciousness. Jenkins walked to the stand with a slow, heavy gait, his face a weathered landscape of decades of grief, but his eyes were filled with a fierce, unyielding resolve as he looked toward the digital evidence boards displaying the interior of the concrete vault. He recalled a series of highly unsettling interactions that took place in the early 2000s, when Vance had actively volunteered to assist the Buckhead Neighborhood Safety Committee during a brief resurgence of regional missing persons investigations. He would come to our community meetings every winter, Jenkins whispered into the microphone, his voice trembling with a mixture of old age and profound betrayal that left several members of the jury panel visibly shaken. He would sit in the front row, look my mother directly in the eye, and offer his professional services as a structural engineer to help install extra security lighting around the neighborhood walking paths. He would tell us that he couldn't rest knowing a predator might be exploiting the lack of physical infrastructure in our historic sectors. He even designed a small, bronze plaque that he proposed placing near the university library to remember Valerie's academic achievements. To think that we shook this man's hand. To think that my mother thanked him for his civic dedication. It is a level of wickedness that I didn't think could exist in human flesh. The state produced a photograph from the Neighborhood Archive, taken in October 2002, showing a middle-aged, polished Arthur Vance standing shoulder to shoulder with local civic leaders at a charity drive for public safety, his expression calm, detached, and completely normal. The image was a masterclass in psychopathic manipulation, an active predator celebrating community security initiatives with the very people he had devastated, using their collective grief as an emotional radar shield to ensure that the municipal gaze would never turn inward toward the basement of his Peachtree Road workshop. In the gallery, several retired university researchers who had worked alongside Vance during his consultancy years buried their faces in their hands, unable to look at the screen as the complete degradation of their professional trust was laid bare before the world. The defense team tried desperately to salvage their position during a highly aggressive cross-examination of Jenkins, attempting to suggest that Vance's close relationship with the community was a genuine reflection of his professional dedication, and that his early interest in the municipal infrastructure maps was simply part of his routine training as an ambitious consultant familiarizing himself with the structural layout of his sectors. The defense attorney questioned whether Jenkins' modern memories had been contaminated by the intense, sensational media coverage surrounding the modern georadar discovery, suggesting that 27 years of frustration had caused the family to retroactively twist harmless, supportive gestures into something sinister. Isn't it true, Mr. Jenkins, that before this discovery, your community considered Mr. Vance to be a quiet, eccentric but ultimately harmless neighbor who supported your safety initiatives? The attorney barked. But Jenkins remained unmoving, his gaze locked onto the image of the concrete bunker. He wasn't our neighbor, Jenkins replied with a cold, devastating clarity. He was a ghost collector watching us weep over the empty spaces he made. As the afternoon hours waned, the prosecution introduced the definitive physical alignment data, connecting the unique structural markers inside the concrete vault back to the specific mechanics of Vance's automated workshop equipment. Using advanced digital forensic reconstruction software, engineering specialists had scanned the interior tool marks left on the steel restraint bars anchored inside the concrete matrix, recreating a highly precise 3D mathematical model of the specific industrial metal cutting lathe Vance operated in his basement workshop. They matched this model with the physical manufacturing anomalies found on his preserved drilling presses, proving that the hardware inside the vault was fabricated using the exact same mechanical cutting edges and unique drill bit defects that were currently sitting on his workbenches 3 feet away. The legal commentators broadcasting from the courthouse steps noted that the state had successfully constructed an inescapable circle of validation, binding the legacy of the deceased consultant within a cage made of molecular science, physical engineering, and direct biometric links. The narrative of a cold case frozen in time had been transformed into a Don Dap, rapid-fire execution of justice that was systematically dismantling the history of an elite suburban neighborhood minute by minute. The city of Atlanta, wrapped in the heavy humidity of the July evening, waited with a collective, breathless anticipation for the trial to move toward its next phase, knowing that the structural walls that had protected a monster for 27 years were finally being crushed into dust beneath the wheels of the law. The high-voltage glare of the mobile forensic trailers seemed to intensify with every passing hour as the fourth phase of the state's structural excavation into the life of Arthur Vance descended into the absolute abyss of his early engineering career. The tactical perimeter around the downtown Atlanta Judicial Annex had grown into a permanent federal enclave, with armored transport vehicles blocking the side avenues and Georgia state troopers standing guard at every structural entrance. Inside Courtroom 4A, the air was dense, choked by the collective trauma of a city discovering that its history had been guarded by a wolf in the most trusted architectural uniforms of the state. Assistant District Attorney Marcus Vance returned to the central podium, his physical movements deliberate, carrying a heavy, combination-locked metal briefcase that had been retrieved from a highly secure storage locker at the regional FBI field office just hours before dawn. The legal strategy for the morning was unyielding: to expose the systemic, mathematical precision with which Vance had utilized his high-level freelance consultancy access to actively sabotage the initial missing persons investigation during the critical transition period between 1999 and 2002. To establish this structural betrayal with clinical certainty, the prosecution called to the stand senior digital forensic archivist Thomas Vance, a man who had spent the last 6 months conducting a total digital exhumation of the university's earliest automated construction tracking databases. Vance adjusted his glasses and projected a series of glowing terminal logs onto the massive presentation screens, illuminating the internal data transactions of the biomedical research facility's mainframe system from the late 90s. When the university began migrating its handwritten facility access records and structural blueprints into the first generation of digital storage servers in 1999, the access protocols for freelance consultants were incredibly primitive, Vance explained, his voice flat, cutting through the heavy silence of the gallery. There were no secondary security clearances, no automated background tracking, and no biometric logging. A user with a master engineering clearance code could enter the database, alter physical structural archives, overwrite facility blueprint modifications, and completely erase digital footprint trails without leaving a single trace on the public interface. The courtroom watched in absolute fixation as Vance advanced the digital timeline on the screen, revealing a series of highly specific, late-night system logins executed between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. during the winter of 1999. The terminal tracking codes used for these clandestine database modifications did not belong to the active detectives assigned to the Valerie Jenkins Missing Persons Squad. Instead, they matched the precise internal routing number of the Freelance Engineering Architecture Terminal 14, the exact hardware station assigned to lead structural consultant Arthur Vance during his on-site facility design shifts. The data showed that over a period of 14 days, someone utilizing that specific station had systematically accessed the digital index file for the biomedical facility's underground storage network, altering the catalog numbers for the physical blueprint boxes containing the original subterranean pipeline layouts, routing them to an entirely incorrect, dead-end archiving index in an abandoned off-site records center. The prosecution argued that this wasn't a clerical oversight or a standard administrative error. It was a highly organized, digital shell game executed by a predator who understood that if structural blueprints were lost in the filing system, no municipal expansion project or routine building inspection could ever uncover the hidden variants in his own residential basement line. By mislabeling the catalog numbers from a secure, active infrastructure line to an unindexed, dark archiving vault, Vance had effectively sentenced the physical blueprint records of the surrounding Buckhead utility lines to a slow, rotting decay that he believed would permanently destroy the spatial markers of his crime. The estate's corporate defense team sat perfectly motionless at their table, their fingers flat against the dark wood, their expressions rigid as Vance's early digital fingerprints were laid bare before the jury panel. The state then advanced its presentation from digital data manipulation back into the world of physical violence, calling to the stand Dr. Eris Vance, a world-renowned forensic pathologist and blunt force trauma specialist from the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology. Dr. Vance took the stand with a calm, clinical authority, displaying highly enhanced, 3D laser-reconstructed models of Valerie Jenkins' skeletal remains, specifically focusing on the severe fractures to her right forearm and the base of her cranium. For 27 years, the public narrative suggested that the victim was snatched from her townhouse using chemical restraints or a sudden, nonviolent interception, Dr. Vance testified, using a digital stylus to trace the microscopic stress fractures along the bone. However, our modern ballistic casting software has revealed a highly specific, linear indentation pattern that cannot be replicated by human hands or conventional restraints. The impact force left an exact, semi-cylindrical cross-section with a distinct, dual-ridged structural margin. The courtroom held its collective breath as Dr. Vance overlaid the 3D laser scan of a standard-issue, 1999-era, heavy industrial steel pipe wrench, the exact model that was recovered from the primary maintenance rack of Arthur Vance's personal basement workshop. The physical contours of the tool locked into the bone fractures with a terrifying, microscopic alignment, matching the precise weight, density, and structural ridge configuration of the blunt force trauma that had broken Valerie's arm before ending her life inside the vault. The fracture pattern proves with absolute mathematical certainty that the implement used to execute this assault was a heavy structural tool wielded with extreme downward force, Dr. Vance explained, his clinical voice dropping the final hammer blow onto the gallery. This wasn't a chaotic, disorganized attack with a weapon of convenience. This was a systematic, authoritative utilization of an industrial service tool used to completely crush a human being's capacity for flight. The psychological impact of this medical reconstruction caused an immediate, violent emotional reaction in the gallery, with several distant relatives of the Jenkins family breaking down into audible, muffled sobs, their faces buried in their hands as the true weapon of the engineer was revealed to be the instrument of their daughter's destruction. In the third row of the courtroom, a small group of retired university safety officers sat frozen, their expressions rigid with a mixture of profound shock and deep, systemic shame as they realized they had stood in the university corridors alongside a monster, holding the exact same architectural clearances that had been used to track a 24-year-old student. Thorne's legal advisors remained entirely locked behind a mask of chilling, detached professionalism, their eyes staring straight ahead, completely unmoving as the weapon on the screen flickered against their files. The afternoon session moved toward a critical legal showdown when the defense team launched a ferocious, desperate cross-examination of Dr. Vance, attempting to challenge the scientific validity of the 3D ballistic casting software. The lead estate attorney stepped forward, his voice raised in an aggressive, rapid-fire attempt to insert reasonable doubt into the minds of the judicial panel, arguing that 27 years of chemical concrete exposure and skeletal degradation could easily alter the shape of bone fractures, creating false similarities to modern industrial tools. Isn't it true, Dr. Vance, that high alkalinity industrial concrete, moisture, and the shifting pressure of the masonry inside that sealed vault could create microscopic stress fractures that mimic almost any linear object after nearly 3 decades? The attorney barked, his hands gesturing wildly. But Dr. Vance remained entirely unyielding, producing a secondary dataset derived from deep tissue bone mineral density testing. Concrete encasement causes surface bone flaking and random chemical splintering, counselor, the doctor replied coldly. It does not create a dual-ridged, structural margin with a precise engineering specification of 32 millimeters. The Earth can destroy evidence, but it cannot manufacture the exact dimensions of a professional-issue industrial wrench. The state then introduced its final, most devastating witness for the fourth phase, 74-year-old Beatrice Lang, who had served as a volunteer student dispatcher at the University Biomedical Security Center on the exact night Valerie vanished from her townhouse. Lang, her voice thin but absolute, recalled a highly unusual interaction that took place at approximately 1:45 a.m., just minutes before the white utility van was seen idling near the cul-de-sac. She testified that she had observed an authorized contractor vehicle matching Vance's van slowing down near the university's laboratory exit, its side spotlight scanning the perimeter before turning its beams toward the local infrastructure junction boxes. I thought it was just a routine facility check because of the ongoing expansion project, Lang whispered into the microphone, her hands shaking slightly as the historical memory filled the modern room. The driver didn't get out of the van. He just sat behind the glass, watching the facility line. A few minutes later, the main telephone lines and automated tracking modems for that exact university quadrant experienced a sudden, total power failure that lasted for 45 minutes. We assumed it was an internal fuse shorting out under the heavy summer air conditioning load, but now I know that someone had to manually trip the main line isolation breakers at the external utility junction box near the main Peachtree Road line. The prosecution immediately produced a certified copy of Vance's official university maintenance log from July 14, 1999, proving that his personal contractor code was the only clearance authorized to bypass the security seals on the external utility junction box during that specific pre-dawn window. Furthermore, a physical inspection of the external junction box conducted by modern state investigators revealed that the heavy iron hatch had been opened using a specialized, master engineering passkey, the exact type of physical key that was carried exclusively on the tool rings of lead structural consultants to manage facility emergencies. The circle of validation had tightened once again, proving that Vance had systematically utilized his position of absolute structural trust to completely blind the university communication networks, isolate his target's research records, and execute the abduction under the protective cover of an engineered infrastructure blackout. As the judge ordered a late afternoon adjournment, the legal commentators gathering on the steps of the annex noted that the state had successfully transformed the inquiry from a simple cold case resolution into a breathtaking exposure of an architectural serial predator who had used the city's own infrastructure networks as a weapon of captivity. The Don Dapp, fast-paced presentation of modern digital mapping, forensic bone casting, and historical logistics had left the estate's legal defense entirely stripped of their conventional stratagems, their financial protection maneuvers reduced to desperate, shouting objections that were systematically overruled by the bench. The city of Atlanta, wrapped in the heavy, humid air of the July evening, stood on the precipice of a total structural transformation, knowing that the ghost of Valerie Jenkins was systematically dismantling the legacy of a respected consultant, forcing the community to face the absolute vengeance of a truth that had finally broken through the concrete. The morning sun of July 2nd, 2026, failed to warm the stone steps of the Atlanta Judicial Annex, where the atmosphere had hardened into a permanent state of high-alert federal security. As the fifth session of this landmark cold case trial commenced, the strategic momentum shifted from the physical evidence of the 1999 crime scene directly to the tracking of a terrifying, decades-long structural camouflage. The state was no longer merely prosecuting a historic murder. They were dissecting an active, systematic infiltration of the city's highest municipal development and infrastructure command structures. Assistant District Attorney Marcus Vance stepped to the podium, his expression an unreadable mask of clinical intent, carrying an encrypted data storage drive that had been cleared for release by the Department of Justice just minutes before the opening gavel. The objective for this phase was devastatingly clear: to expose how Arthur Vance utilized his expanding administrative access through the late 2000s and 2010s to turn the internal city planning and subterranean surveying networks into his personal defensive shield. The prosecution called to the stand senior intelligence analyst David Vance of the FBI's Public Corruption Task Force, a man who had spent the previous 4 months running a total forensic audit on Arthur Vance's private administrative history. Analyst Vance took the stand, adjusted the multimedia interface, and projected a sprawling, interconnected digital matrix across the courtroom screens, revealing the hidden administrative architecture of the Atlanta City Planning Department's internal tracking logs from 2001 to 2015. When a freelance structural consultant climbs the professional ladder to become a lead regional consultant and a senior engineering inspector for municipal infrastructure, their access to confidential, multi-agency geospatial files expands exponentially, Analyst Vance explained, his voice even and precise, cutting through the absolute silence of the gallery. What our specialized audit has revealed is that Arthur Vance did not merely accept these high-profile city contracts for professional advancement. He targeted specific administrative positions within the zoning board and the subterranean utility review panel to ensure he possessed absolute veto power over the archiving of cold case geographic evidence. The courtroom watched in frozen fascination as a series of red highlighted alerts illuminated the digital matrix, tracking Vance's personal login credentials across hundreds of classified data transactions. The records showed that every single time a new generation of investigators or utility workers attempted to pull the historical property blueprints for the Peachtree Road sector for a routine multi-year grid review, Vance's digital profile intercepted the request within 24 hours. In the winter of 2008, when a local construction crew proposed utilizing early ground-penetrating radar profiling techniques on the specific block encompassing his residence to prepare for an interstate transit expansion, a command-level administrative directive signed by lead consultant Arthur Vance abruptly shut down the funding for the survey line, citing budgetary reallocations and a lack of immediate structural necessity in the historical preservation zones. It was a cold-blooded chess match played against the development of forensic science and civil engineering. Vance was actively monitoring the technological landscape, using his municipal authority to kill the investigation every time science drew too close to unmasking his identity. The state argued that this pattern of behavior represented a continuous, ongoing execution of the original conspiracy to cover up the murder, an active exploitation of public office that extended the legal liability of his estate into the modern era. The estate's corporate defense team sat perfectly rigid at their table, their eyes fixed on the glowing terminal logs that documented Vance's 44-year campaign of internal structural sabotage. The calculated brilliance of his defensive strategy was laid bare for the jury box. He hadn't hidden in the shadows of the city. He had hidden in the center of the light, wearing the credentials of a master command consultant, using the very machinery of civic infrastructure to suppress the voice of his victim. The prosecution then shifted its presentation from internal data manipulation to a terrifying exposure of Vance's hidden physical life outside his primary residence, calling to the stand forensic materials expert Cheryl Vance. Expert Vance displayed a series of high-definition satellite photographs and ground-penetrating radar scans of a remote, 3-acre property located near the rugged foothills of North Georgia, which Vance had purchased under a completely untraceable corporate shell name in 2005. For decades, colleagues believed the isolated cabin was nothing more than a quiet weekend retreat for a hardworking, highly respected bachelor engineer who spent his spare time hunting in the mountain passes. However, the modern federal search of the property, executed under a top-secret national security warrant, had unsealed a secondary hidden subterranean bunker dug beneath the floorboards of an old, abandoned hunting shed. The courtroom held its breath as expert Vance projected photographs of the interior of this secondary hidden bunker, a clinical, soundproof chamber reinforced with heavy industrial steel sheeting and equipped with professional-grade restraint fixtures anchored directly into the solid concrete foundation. This structure was built with an extreme level of architectural intent, expert Vance testified, pointing with a digital stylus at the heavy ventilation shafts and the independent electrical grid. The soil analysis inside the concrete seams revealed trace chemical signatures matching industrial-strength cleaning agents used exclusively in forensic laboratories to eliminate biological material. Arthur Vance didn't build a survival shelter. He constructed a secondary, highly secure, private tactical intercept zone designed to hold human beings completely outside the grid of the civilized world. The discovery of the secondary hidden bunker sent a physical shockwave through the gallery, transforming the trial into a breathless confrontation with a dark, sprawling serial narrative that had remained invisible to the public for a generation. The prosecution introduced an itemized manifest of property recovered from the steel safe inside the secondary bunker, including dozens of pieces of women's jewelry, driver's licenses from 3 different states, and worn, analog cassette tapes dating from the mid-2000s to the late 2010s. Each item was cataloged alongside a specific, handwritten date that correlated directly with an unresolved missing persons file from the regional Rocky Mountain and Southeastern law enforcement networks. The terrifying implication hung over the jury box like a heavy fog. Valerie Jenkins was not an isolated casualty of a rookie consultant's panic. She was the opening chapter of a lifelong, covert career of calculated, authoritative violence executed by a man who wore an engineer's uniform by day and operated a torture chamber by night. The defense table erupted into a frantic sequence of objections as the lead estate counsel scrambled to launch an aggressive counterattack, attempting to separate the hidden bunker findings from the specific murder trial of Valerie Jenkins. The attorney leaped to his feet, arguing that the items in the safe and the existence of the secondary subterranean room were entirely prejudicial and proven allegations that had no direct forensic link to the 1999 campus abduction. The prosecution is attempting to manufacture a horrific serial predator out of thin air to inflame the emotions of the jury because their physical case from 1999 is built on ancient, degraded timelines, the attorney shouted, his hands slamming onto the podium. But Assistant District Attorney Vance stood unmoving, holding a single plastic evidence bag containing a small, weathered item retrieved from the very bottom of the bunker's safe, the faded, blue university student identification card bearing the name and photograph of Valerie Jenkins. The physical presence of the card in the modern courtroom brought a definitive, crushing silence to the estate's legal defense team's arguments, locking the legacy of the deceased consultant within the absolute perimeter of his own trophy room. The card had survived nearly 3 decades inside the darkness of that steel safe, a silent, unyielding witness that Vance had carried with him through every house he owned, every contract he received, and every municipal command position he assumed. It proved with absolute, undeniable clarity that the murder of Valerie Jenkins was the defining pivot of his life, a prize he kept hidden beneath the earth while he walked the hallways of the city planning offices as a symbol of public infrastructure management. In the gallery, Raymond Jenkins stood up, his body trembling with a mixture of overwhelming grief and righteous fury, his eyes locked onto the digital display of the safe contents until federal marshals gently guided him back into his seat. The cross-examination of expert Vance by the defense was a desperate, rapidly unraveling attempt to challenge the chain of custody regarding the search of the North Georgia property, suggesting that federal agents had planted the student ID card to secure a high-profile civil asset forfeiture against a local engineering legend. The defense attorney questioned the validity of the national security warrant, demanding to know why the local Atlanta police were completely excluded from the initial raid on their lead consultant's property. Isn't it true that your task force operated in absolute secrecy because you knew you didn't have enough traditional probable cause to satisfy a standard state judge? The attorney barked. But expert Vance remained entirely unyielding, producing the encrypted video logs of the raid, which documented the exact moment the safe was opened in front of independent, third-party federal observers. We operated in secrecy because the target's legacy was deeply embedded within the active municipal planning offices, and his automated database credentials could monitor our geographic movements, she replied coldly. The integrity of this evidence is absolute. The card was found inside his personal safe, locked behind a biometric code that required his own thumbprint profile to verify the physical locks. As the afternoon hours waned, the prosecution introduced the high-definition biometric matching data, comparing the microscopic wear patterns on the recovered student ID card with the physical scratches on the dashboard of Vance's original 1999 utility van, which had been tracked down to a secure scrap repository in South Georgia. The forensic analysts proved that the card had been forcibly pried from the vehicle's sun visor clip using a standard engineering mechanical drafting scale, the exact, unique technical tool that was carried exclusively on the tool rings of lead structural consultants during field surveys. The Dawn DAP, fast-paced synchronization of satellite imaging, ground radar, and direct physical links had completely decimated the defense's structural narrative, transforming their case into a series of frantic, shouting maneuvers that were systematically neutralized by the bench. The legal analysts gathering on the steps of City Hall reported that the state had effectively closed the final door on Arthur Vance's 27-year illusion, proving that the blueprints he had drafted as a symbol of progress were merely the architectural drawings of an unrepentant predator. The city of Atlanta, wrapped in the heavy, humid wind blowing off the southern plains, stood on the verge of a total institutional purification, watching the slow, scientific dismantling of a man who had used their structural trust as a weapon. The ghost of Valerie Jenkins had finally broken through the steel doors of the hidden bunker, stripping the consultant of his legacy and forcing his estate to face the absolute vengeance of a law that had finally caught up with his tracks. The suffocating humidity of the late Georgia summer seemed to seep directly into the heavy masonry walls of the Atlanta Federal Courthouse, but inside Courtroom 4A, the atmosphere remained unyielding and bone-chillingly cold. As the 6th consecutive session of the state's multi-layered inquiry into the architectural legacy of Arthur Vance resumed, the strategic focus shifted seamlessly from the macro-manipulation of the city's municipal databases to the highly specific, dark chronological gap that occurred immediately following the night of Valerie Jenkins' sudden disappearance in July 1999. The prosecution's tactical objective for this afternoon was absolute: to demonstrate that every single logistical movement executed by the reclusive structural engineer between the summer of 1999 and his formal corporate stabilization in the early 2000s was part of a cold-blooded, mathematically precise stabilization of his secret subterranean kingdom. Assistant District Attorney Marcus Vance stepped to the central podium, his posture flawless, holding a heavily cataloged manual of original, hand-inked field surveying journals that had been pulled from a secure iron locker in Vance's primary basement workshop. To deliver this structural narrative with clinical devastation, the state called to the stand retired forensic records analyst Dr. Julian Mercer, a man who had spent the better part of 3 decades analyzing data tracking anomalies within corporate and municipal real estate firms across the American South. Dr. Mercer took the witness stand, adjusted his glasses, and projected high-resolution digital scans of the original handwritten daily log sheets Vance had submitted to the University Planning Office during the frantic weeks following the 1999 abduction. For 27 years, the public was led to believe that the early investigation into Valerie Jenkins' disappearance failed due to an absence of immediate witnesses or a lack of advanced genetic profiling techniques. Dr. Mercer began, his voice flat, cutting through the heavy silence of the gallery. However, when we subject the physical paper logs of the engineering consultant to modern spectrographic ink analysis, a terrifying pattern of immediate, active cover-up emerges. Vance did not panic. He utilized his technical training to calibrate a paper trail that would permanently misdirect the initial homicide squad. The courtroom watched in absolute fixation as the digital presentation illuminated a series of manual odometer tracking adjustments and equipment calibration entries executed by Vance between July 15th and July 20th, 1999, the exact 5-day window when local search teams were combing the immediate Buckhead district with tracking dogs. The records showed that Vance had manually altered the operational logs of his white utility van, claiming that the vehicle was stationary at an interstate drainage project site 20 miles west of the city center during the pre-dawn hours of July 14th. However, the spectrographic analysis of the blue ink utilized on those specific lines revealed a massive chemical anomaly. The entries had been backdated using a specific brand of high-density graphic plotting ink that Vance didn't even purchase from his engineering suppliers until 3 days after the disappearance took place. The prosecution argued that this wasn't a casual administrative correction or a standard clerical error. It was a highly organized, retroactive alibi manufactured by a predator who understood that a professional vehicle's mileage history was the single most dangerous physical link that could bring state troopers to his residential perimeter. By utilizing his technical graphic pens to perfectly mimic his own earlier writing style under a magnifying lamp, Vance had successfully engineered an unblemished paper shield that completely satisfied the primitive, manual verification protocols of the late 20th century. Vance's legacy defense team sat entirely frozen at their table, their eyes locked onto the chemical analysis charts that effectively turned the deceased consultant's own precise handwriting into an absolute confession of guilt. The state then advanced its presentation from paper data forgery back into the world of cold physical interactions, calling to the stand 68-year-old Richard Davies, a former senior project coordinator who had overseen the university's biomedical engineering expansion project in 1999. Davies, his face pale as he looked at the digital displays of the hidden subterranean vault, recalled a high-stakes emergency administrative briefing that took place on July 22, 1999, just 8 days after Valerie vanished from her townhouse. We had called a mandatory meeting of all contractors and consultants to hand over the complete structural access badge swipe histories and private parking logs for the entire laboratory quadrant, Davies testified, his hands gripping the edges of the witness box. The freelance consultant who volunteered to collect, index, and organize those tracking files for the Detective Bureau was none other than our lead structural advisor, Arthur Vance. He sat right across from me in the conference room, wearing his corporate security credentials, entirely calm, and assured us that his engineering firm would use its automated plotting software to map any anomalies for the police. The courtroom held its collective breath as Davies produced a copy of the original file transmission receipt, bearing Vance's sharp, precise signature in the bottom right corner. The documentation proved that the master digital access logbook for the night of July 14th, the logbook that contained the unique serial numbers of every contractor badge that had approached the university's external utility junction box, never actually reached the central homicide squad. It had been replaced by a truncated, reformatted datasheet created on Vance's private office computer, a document that omitted any mention of his personal engineering badge profile or the unauthorized, late-night activation of the facility's manual override codes. The prosecution demonstrated that Vance had used his position of supreme professional trust to act as a data filter for the authorities, systematically cutting his own electronic footprints out of the master files before the detectives even knew the data existed. The defense team, realizing the devastating structural weight of this testimony, attempted a fierce counterattack during their cross-examination of Davies. The lead estate attorney stepped forward, attempting to suggest that the administrative filing discrepancies were a natural reflection of the chaotic, paper-driven transition the university was undergoing during the multi-million-dollar modernization project. The attorney questioned whether Davies could definitively prove that Vance had acted with malicious intent, rather than simply compiling a massive, messy data set under intense timeline pressures from his superiors. Isn't it true, Mr. Davies, that database files and contractor tracking sheets were routinely misplaced or corrupted across every sector of that massive biomedical construction zone during that high-intensity summer? The attorney barked. But Davies remained entirely unyielding, his gaze fixed on the display of the hidden bunker control panel. Blueprints are misplaced by accident, counselor, Davies replied coldly. But they don't selectively delete a single lead engineer's security badge number from an infrastructure blackout log. That requires a deliberate, surgical hand. It requires an insider. The afternoon session took a deeply emotional and haunting turn when the prosecution introduced a series of recorded telephone messages left on the answering machine of Valerie's childhood home during the autumn of 1999. The victim's family, whose mental stability had rapidly deteriorated under the pressure of the absolute silence from the police department, had kept the tapes in a secure safe box, always hoping that a random tip would break the case wide open. The courtroom fell into a heavy, paralyzed silence as the scratchy, analog audio began to play through the modern courtroom speakers. The voice that emerged was a terrifying, authoritative tone, utilizing the exact clinical vocabulary of an official public safety advisory to mislead the family. Hello, Mr. and Mrs. Jenkins. This is the Regional Municipal Infrastructure Development Bureau calling with a follow-up utility assessment update. The recording played the low static of the magnetic tape filling the room. We have completed a thorough geospatial scan of the old drainage networks and corporate transit lines operating near the northern Buckhead boundaries. A primary structural anomaly has been identified suggesting a non-residential, transient transit route out of state, and our engineering teams are currently coordinating with federal transportation authorities to monitor the outer sectors. We strongly advise that you direct all future private search efforts away from the local university construction zones to avoid compromising the active, heavy machinery operations and the regional infrastructure lines. We are staying close to this situation, and we will protect your family's privacy. The cruelty of the recording was psychological warfare in its purest form. The deceased consultant had not only taken their daughter's life and entombed her remains in the masonry of his basement, but he had actively manipulated her grieving parents into believing that the investigation was making massive progress along the interstate transportation corridors, effectively steering all public eye and police attention away from the very property lines where his concrete mixer had been operating. In the gallery, Raymond Jenkins buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with an overwhelming grief as the raw, calculated malice of the man his family had trusted washed over the modern room. Arthur Vance had spent his entire life running a marathon of pure intellect against the clock, completely immune to the personal liabilities that govern ordinary citizens, utilizing the prestige of a civil engineering career to mask a deep-seated, monstrous depravity that had never truly slept. As the afternoon hours waned, the prosecution introduced the definitive physical alignment data, connecting the unique mechanical markings on the recovered structural components of the vault directly to the specific tools found inside Vance's office drawers. Using advanced digital casting software, forensic engineers had scanned the structural layout of the heavy steel blast doors that hid the bunker, proving that the locking mechanisms had been calibrated using a highly specific, custom-machined calibration tool that Vance had kept inside his personal drafting kit until his death in 2018. The circle of validation had tightened into an absolute, inescapable cage, proving that the blueprints Vance had drafted as a symbol of architectural progress were merely the blueprints of an unrepentant predator who had turned the city's own infrastructure into an instrument of permanent human captivity. The city of Atlanta, wrapped in the heavy humidity of the July evening, stood on the precipice of a total institutional purification, knowing that the ghost of Valerie Jenkins had finally broken through the reinforced walls, stripping the mask of anonymity from her captor and forcing the world to confront the absolute, undeniable truth of her story. The morning rain of July 10th, 2026, brought a temporary cooling to the Georgia air, but inside Courtroom 4A of the Atlanta Federal Judicial Annex, the atmospheric pressure reached a crushing, near unbearable peak. As the seventh major session of this multi-generational forensic inquiry opened, the state prepared to advance its narrative past the mechanical architecture of the bunker and dive directly into the deep institutional cover-up that Vance maintained through the peak of his professional career in the late 2000s. The objective for the prosecution was devastatingly clear: to demonstrate to the judicial panel exactly how this reclusive engineer managed to insulate his historical crimes from the rapid, sweeping advancement of automated fingerprint registries, interstate criminal tracking indices, and DNA identification grids that redefined law enforcement at the turn of the century. Assistant District Attorney Marcus Vance stepped to the podium, his posture immaculate, holding a newly unsealed, classified database audit compiled by the Department of Homeland Security's Cyberforensics Division. To lay bare this long-standing campaign of structural insulation, the state called to the stand Senior Special Agent Laura Vance, a 20-year veteran of the FBI's Public Corruption and Technological Crime Task Force. Agent Vance had spent the last 5 months conducting an exhaustive digital exhumation of Arthur Vance's private corporate network activity logs, tracing his remote system commands from 2004 to 2018. Projecting a massive, multi-layered digital timeline across the courtroom screens, Agent Vance pointed to a series of highly anomalies in the data transactions of the Georgia Department of Transportation's regional geospatial surveying servers. Arthur Vance did not merely sit back and hope that time would wash away his tracks. Agent Vance testified, her voice resonant and unyielding, cutting through the heavy silence of the gallery. He utilized a highly sophisticated, technical strategy known as geospatial dossier manipulation. Because his private engineering firm was contracted to audit the structural integrity of municipal pipelines and underground fiber optic corridors across the Buckhead district, he possessed the unique administrative credentials to access, modify, and selectively archive the city's master subsurface mapping files without triggering standard cybersecurity alarms. The courtroom watched in absolute fixation as a sequence of red highlighted lines illuminated the digital timeline, tracking Vance's personal remote network logins back to specific, late-night data adjustments executed during the winter of 2006, the exact period when the state initiated a massive, automated modernization of its subterranean utility archives. The records showed that whenever a municipal utility team or a private real estate development firm requested a high-density subsurface survey line within a 2-mile radius of his Peachtree Road residence, Vance's digital administrative profile personally intercepted the automated queue. Using command-level legacy overrides that he had acquired during his early consultancies for the city's emergency infrastructure networks, he manually injected corrupted data packets or artificial radar clutter profiles into the specific sector maps encompassing his property line. The prosecution demonstrated that this was a cold-blooded, digital shell game executed with absolute mathematical precision. Vance was actively weaponizing his technical knowledge of ground-penetrating radar systems to manufacture an artificial blind spot beneath his own basement workshop. He created a digital smoke screen in the master city planning archives, ensuring that any standard commercial or municipal radar scan of the block would register his property's foundation as a solid, uniform block of native clay rather than a hollow, steel-reinforced concrete chamber. The estate's corporate defense attorneys sat completely paralyzed at their table, their fingers flat against their files, as the electronic blueprints of this decades-long defensive sabotage were exposed to the public light. The state then advanced its presentation from the digital universe back into the realm of cold, physical deception, calling to the stand Dr. Raymond Thorne, a retired forensic profiling specialist who had consulted for the state's municipal licensing boards for over 30 years. Dr. Thorne displayed side-by-side digital scans of the physical wellness profiles, ergonomic evaluation charts, and biometric fingerprint cards filed by Arthur Vance during his mandatory renewals for his professional engineering licenses between 2002 and 2012. The data revealed a terrifying anomaly that completely unmasked the hypervigilant discipline the consultant practiced every day of his adult life to evade the automated systems of the modern world. When an individual applies for or renews a high-level state infrastructure engineering license, they must submit a full set of biometric fingerprints to be run through the automated integrated criminal identification networks, Dr. Thorne explained, using a digital stylus to trace the microscopic ridge lines of the prints on the screen. When we analyzed Vance's historical fingerprint submissions from the early 2000s, our automated enhancement algorithms detected a highly specific, unnatural distortion along the primary friction ridges of both index fingers and thumbs. This wasn't the result of a natural medical condition or casual scarring. Someone had deliberately, systematically subjected their fingertips to localized, low-intensity chemical acid burns over a period of years, subtly altering the microscopic minutiae points just enough to prevent the early generation of automated fingerprint matching algorithms from linking his prints to the unindexed partial latent prints recovered from Valerie Jenkins' townhouse in 1999. The gallery let out a low, collective murmur of profound horror at the reading of the forensic report, the raw, terrifying discipline of the deceased engineer laid bare before the jury box. Vance had lived his entire life with a calculated mindset of an intelligence operative behind enemy lines, actively self-mutilating his own skin in the privacy of his laboratory to ensure that his biological signature would remain a ghost inside the state's expanding criminal registries. He understood that as technology advanced, his primary vulnerability lay in the microscopic details of his own body, and he systematically executed an ongoing, clinical assault on his own biometrics to preserve the absolute anonymity of his suburban fortress. The prosecution then shifted its focus to the social and professional circles Vance navigated within the elite academic and civic committees of Atlanta, proving that he utilized his immense professional prestige as an emotional radar shield to completely blind the community to his dark, dual existence. The state called 64-year-old Evelyn Sinclair, a prominent civic organizer who had served alongside Vance on the Buckhead Historical Preservation Society and various university planning boards throughout the late 2010s. Sinclair, her voice trembling with a mixture of deep betrayal and absolute disbelief, looked directly at the digital display showing the interior of the concrete bunker that had been dug beneath the house she had visited for neighborhood meetings. He was the most intensely quiet, dependable, and meticulously polite professional in our entire preservation circle, Sinclair whispered into the microphone, her hands shaking slightly as the historical memories filled the modern courtroom. He donated his personal engineering services to help preserve our historic architectural sectors, spent hours drafting free structural assessments for our local libraries, and was a constant, respected voice for municipal preservation. But looking back through the lens of this horrific discovery, there were always these strange, hypervigilant boundaries around his personal life. He never allowed his photograph to be published in our annual Historical Society journals or charity programs. If someone brought out a smartphone to take a group picture at a committee dinner, he would suddenly excuse himself to check on the catering logistics or turn his face entirely away to consult with the facility layout blueprints. We always assumed he was just a humble, old-school intellectual who shunned the modern spotlight. Now, it turns my stomach to realize he was actively hiding his face from national facial recognition databases while pretending to be a guardian of our neighborhood's history. The state immediately produced several high-resolution group photographs from those historical preservation galas where Vance had failed to evade the camera lens entirely. Using modern digital enhancement software, the prosecution zoomed in on the deceased consultant's eyes in a 2014 committee group photograph taken at a civic restoration site. The look captured on his face wasn't one of professional pride or community celebration. It was a cold, hypervigilant, razor-sharp glare directed toward the extreme edge of the frame, the look of a hunted predator who understood with absolute, mathematical certainty that every single flash of a camera bulb carried the technological potential for total public exposure and institutional ruin. The prosecution argued that these images proved Vance was a man trapped in a golden cage of his own engineering, forced to maintain a flawless, unblemished public persona just to keep the authorities from ever looking too closely at the ancient concrete beneath his workshop floorboards. The cross-examination of Sinclair by the lead defense counsel was a calculated, aggressive attempt to separate the asset portfolio of the Vance estate from the horrifying nature of the crime, trying to paint the consultant as a deeply flawed, complex individual who had nonetheless dedicated his later years to genuine public service and architectural preservation. The attorney questioned whether a man who had spent decades protecting historic neighborhoods and supporting municipal development could truly be characterized as a heartless, unrepentant monster from his early years. Is it not possible, Mrs. Sinclair, that the man you knew as Mr. Vance was a truly dedicated engineer who spent his entire adult life contributing to the progress and safety of this city with absolute professional fidelity? The attorney barked, his voice echoing through the silent room. But before Sinclair could respond, Assistant District Attorney Vance leaped to his feet with an immediate, thunderous objection that shook the gallery. "Objection, Your Honor. Professional prestige purchased with the stolen life and total isolation of Valerie Jenkins is not public service. It is an ongoing criminal concealment executed through the exploitation of our city's architectural trust." The judge sustained the objection instantly, ordering the jury to disregard the defense's line of questioning, but the psychological battle lines had been clearly drawn. As the afternoon session drew to a close, the prosecution introduced a series of confidential financial ledger logs from 2016 that showed Vance had begun quietly restructuring his massive real estate holdings and liquid assets into automated offshore corporate trusts managed through highly secretive international banking sectors. This evidence dealt a lethal blow to the defense's financial protection stratagems. It proved that even in his final years, as ground-penetrating radar systems became commercially common, the engineer was actively calibrating a secondary financial escape hatch to insulate his wealth from future legal exposure. The state demonstrated that Vance knew the advancement of forensic science was a slow, closing wall, and he was systematically engineering a final safety system to protect his material legacy from the ultimate reckoning. When the court adjourned for the day, the crowds gathering outside the Atlanta Federal Judicial Annex had grown to unprecedented proportions despite the continuous downpour, with local residents standing beneath a sea of umbrellas to discuss the terrifying, lifelong discipline required to maintain such a massive, subterranean deception in plain sight. The city was no longer just mourning a brilliant medical researcher who vanished from her townhouse on a sweltering summer night in 1999. They were confronting the realization that a human being could completely dissolve his own guilt, step into the highest planning circles of a dynamic metropolis, and walk through the halls of structural authority for 27 years without a single shred of human remorse. The trial was rapidly hurtling toward its final, explosive chapters, and the ghost of Valerie Jenkins had finally broken through the reinforced walls, pulling the master illusionist down into the dark earth where the truth had waited for so long to be brought to light. The morning of July 13, 2026, brought a heavy, stagnant humidity that seemed to weigh down the very walls of Courtroom 4A, yet the spectators inside the Atlanta Federal Judicial Annex sat in rigid, breathless silence. As the eighth session of this extraordinary cold case trial commenced, the prosecution prepared to unveil the most technologically advanced and damning phase of its case, the absolute synchronization of modern digital forensics with the historical physical evidence from 1999. Assistant District Attorney Marcus Vance stepped to the podium with a cold, unyielding confidence, carrying a black encrypted hard drive that contained the results of a multi-agency digital exhumation. The state's objective was to dismantle any remaining doubt regarding the exact timeline of the crime, proving that while Arthur Vance was hiding behind a wall of command-level consultant authority in downtown Atlanta, his digital ghost was actively betraying him across decades of systemic deception. To deliver this forensic hammer blow, the prosecution called to the stand Dr. Eris Vance, the Chief Mobile Forensics and Cellular Triangulation Specialist for the Department of Homeland Security. Dr. Vance, a sharp, clinical expert with decades of experience tracking international fugitives, took the witness stand and adjusted the microphone. Projecting a brilliant, multi-layered 3D digital map of the city of Atlanta onto the large courtroom screens. He illuminated the geographical grid of the Buckhead neighborhood and the surrounding transit corridors exactly as they existed on the night of July 14, 1999. For 27 years, this case was treated as an unresolvable mystery because traditional location data didn't exist in a way that could track a suspect's precise physical movements. Dr. Vance began, his voice cutting through the silence. However, using a revolutionary process known as historical signal remastering, our team was able to extract the raw, dormant frequency logs from the old analog emergency communication towers that line the Peachtree Road corridor in the late 90s. The courtroom watched in absolute fascination as a small, glowing red materialized on the digital map, representing the specialized radio transponder inside Arthur Vance's personal white utility van on that fateful July night. The data showed that while Vance had claimed to be physically present at a municipal drainage project site far west of the city to establish his alibi, his vehicle's unique frequency signature was actually moving in a synchronized, predatory pattern directly behind Valerie Jenkins' townhouse block. The digital trail proved with absolute mathematical certainty that Vance had stalked the young researcher through the dark suburban grid for over 45 minutes, waiting for the precise moment when she would be completely isolated from the local campus security patrols. The red on the screen merged with Valerie's location at exactly 2:14 a.m. near the restricted exit gate, the precise minute that witnesses reported seeing a nondescript white van with faded commercial markings idling near the vehicle line. The prosecution then advanced the timeline on the screen, showing the red migrating away from the Buckhead townhouse and traveling directly toward the isolated residential property on Peachtree Road, where Valerie's frozen skeletal remains were ultimately discovered beneath the roots of the old basement workshop. The utility van's transponder remained completely stationary at that exact residential coordinate for 3 hours and 47 minutes, a window of time that matched perfectly with the physical labor required to mix and excavate a secondary layer of industrial concrete in the freezing rocky clay of the basement foundation. The defendant did not realize that even in 1999, his specialized contractor tools were leaving a permanent, indelible footprint in the electromagnetic ether, Dr. Vance testified, pointing to the glowing cluster of data on the screen. He thought the darkness of the basement shielded from the eyes of the law, but science has allowed us to look back through time and watch him execute his target in real time. The defense table erupted in a flurry of tense, whispered arguments as the lead estate attorney scrambled to launch an aggressive cross-examination. The attorney leaped to his feet, attempting to challenge the scientific reliability of the historical signal remastering technology, arguing that analog tower data from the late 90s was notoriously imprecise and could easily possess a margin of error spanning several miles. Isn't it true, Dr. Vance, that atmospheric conditions, severe summer storm interference, and tower degradation could cause these ancient emergency frequencies to bounce, placing my client at the residence when his radio was simply experiencing a routine technical malfunction? The defense attorney barked, his voice filled with a desperate intensity. But Dr. Vance remained entirely unshakable, producing a secondary, independent dataset derived from the automated computer-aided dispatch system logs of the municipal power grid. "We accounted for signal variance, Counselor," Dr. Vance replied coldly. "The utility vehicle's transponder data is perfectly backed by the automated digital timestamps of the municipal power grid updates along the residential access road." Vance's specific contractor unit tripped the hardware sensors at 2:38 a.m., and his vehicle logged a return code to the city lines at 6:25 a.m. The machine does not lie, and it does not feel pity. The prosecution then shifted from digital mapping to a horrifying examination of the physical tools used to execute the cover-up, calling to the stand forensic materials expert Dr. Helena Rossi. Dr. Rossi displayed a series of high-magnification electron microscope photographs of the rusted iron crowbar that had been recovered from the shallow concrete matrix alongside Valerie's remains during the initial exhumation. The images revealed microscopic fragments of specialized automotive paint embedded within the rusted pitting of the metal tool. "We conducted a chemical spectrographic analysis of these paint fragments," Dr. Rossi explained to the jury, her tone clinical and devastating. The compound matches a highly specific, custom-blended industrial lacquer used exclusively on the fleet of 1998 model utility vans deployed to the Municipal Engineering Division. This crowbar wasn't a tool found randomly in the yard. It was pulled directly from the equipment rack of the defendant's own van to finish the lethal work he began near the townhouse gates. The emotional apex of the afternoon session arrived when the state introduced a newly discovered piece of evidence retrieved from an old, dusty storage locker in downtown Atlanta that had been rented under one of Vance's earliest fraudulent internal aliases. Inside the locker, modern investigators had found a sealed magnetic tape containing a video recorded at a department commendation ceremony in late 2000, just 1 year after the murder. The courtroom fell into a paralyzed, horrified silence as the footage began to play on the screens, showing a young, polished Arthur Vance standing proudly at a podium, accepting an award for exceptional infrastructure performance under pressure, flanked by the senior command staff who praised his dedication to public safety. The video showed Vance, wearing his official engineering uniform, smiling warmly as he shook hands with the city planning director, his chest adorned with the very medal he had earned for his relentless work during the 1999 summer emergencies. The audio captured the defendant's voice, steady and dripping with a sickening, calculated warmth. "I am deeply honored by this recognition, Director. I know this city has faced unimaginable tragedies over the past year, especially with the heartbreaking loss of young citizens like Valerie Jenkins. But I promise you, as long as I serve this department, I will dedicate every ounce of my energy to ensuring that the structural vulnerabilities that target our community are hunted down and brought to absolute stability." The raw, unadulterated psychopathy of a man looking into the eyes of his superiors, wearing the credentials of the state, and promising to protect the public from a tragedy he personally engineered caused multiple members of the gallery to turn their faces away in disgust. At the defense table, Vance's estate representatives finally showed a fracture. Their postures tightened, their expressions became heavy and erratic, and a collective silence ran through their table as the historic words echoed through the room like a curse. As the judge ordered a late afternoon recess, the media outlets broadcasting the trial reported that the state had effectively closed any remaining avenue of escape for the legacy of the deceased captain. The combination of historical signal triangulation, chemical paint matching, and the devastating psychological weight of the awards ceremony footage had transformed the trial into a legal execution of a 27-year-old lie. The city of Atlanta, watching the slow, scientific dismantling of the man who had stolen a life, began to feel the heavy, somber approach of a long-delayed justice. The phantom of Peachtree Road was no longer an unsolved mystery whispered in the dark corners of the local taverns. It was a flesh-and-blood killer caught in the inescapable jaws of modern forensic truth, waiting for the final verdict to fall. The heavy wood panels of courtroom 4A groaned under the psychological weight of an escalating municipal reckoning as the ninth morning session opened to a packed gallery of silent observers. The strategic focus of the state's case against the estate of Arthur Vance now moved past the mathematical certainties of cellular triangulation and chemical tracking, plunging directly into the clinical domain of forensic behavioral analysis. The prosecution's goal for this phase was to expose the exact internal architecture of the deceased engineer's mind, to map out the terrifying cognitive discipline required for a human being to survive 27 years wrapped in the skin of a respected civic advisor while maintaining an active, subterranean house of horrors. Assistant District Attorney Marcus Vance stepped to the central podium, his physical movements precise, adjusting a thick mental profile binder before calling the state's final major behavioral authority, Dr. Julian Mercer, a renowned forensic psychologist and former chief profiler for the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. Dr. Mercer took the stand, carrying an extensive psychological evaluation folder compiled from a comprehensive audit of Vance's personal field logs, medical histories, and hidden personal artifacts. The room fell into an immediate, freezing silence as he began to dissect the fundamental personality structure of the man who had engineered Valerie Jenkins' total isolation. What we are looking at in this case is a definitive textbook manifestation of a highly organized, technocentric sociopath, Dr. Mercer began, his clinical voice carrying an absolute, chilling clarity through the microphone. Arthur Vance did not experience reality through the standard emotional frameworks of empathy or communal guilt. To his mind, the city of Atlanta was not a collection of living human beings, but a complex mechanical circuit board, and the individuals within his sector were merely movable components that he could manipulate or permanently archive according to his structural desires. Once the physical act of abduction was complete, Vance practiced a process known as cognitive reindexing. He literally compartmented the crime within his mind as a completed engineering project, separating it entirely from his daily public identity as a civic preservationist. The prosecution projected a series of transcribed notes taken from the personal, handwritten daily planners Vance had kept locked inside his corporate desk at the Municipal Infrastructure Annex. These entries, written in his true, flawless drafting script with an alarming, calculated detachment, revealed a complete absence of human remorse that left the court stenographers visibly staggered. When a junior colleague had casually asked him during a 2012 infrastructure project review if he ever felt overwhelmed by the cold cases and tragedies that historically plagued the older Buckhead sectors, Vance had written a chilling reflection in his private log that evening. The efficiency of a structural system is not determined by the random survival of its individual cells, but by the stability of its macroarchitecture. The community demands order, lighting, and sound foundations. If a single component vanishes from the grid, the system automatically recalibrates to fill the void. I do not mourn the lost energy of the past. I secure the infrastructure of the present. The gallery let out a collective, horrified murmur at the reading of the passage. The raw, chilling psychopathy of the deceased consultant laid bare in his own private ink before the jury box. Dr. Mercer then walked the jury through the terrifying daily discipline required for Vance to maintain his dual existence during the absolute peak of his professional standing in Georgia during the late 2010s. The state displayed a highly detailed, color-coded behavioral calendar found hidden inside an encrypted, automated backup partition on Vance's secure office server, titled simply the Master Log. This digital asset proved that every evening for over 15 years, Vance spent exactly 45 minutes reviewing the public communications of the active cold case squads, meticulously analyzing whether any new construction permits or public utility upgrades would cross the precise spatial coordinates of his Peachtree Road foundation. The log included lists of junior civil engineers who had shown an interest in updating the neighborhood's old subterranean radar maps, notes on whether any old campus acquaintances had attempted to re-interview witnesses, and detailed records of his personal biometric alterations compared to the forensic markers held in the state repositories. He lived his entire adult life in a state of total structural mobilization, Dr. Mercer testified, pointing with a laser stylus to the rigid schedule on the screens. Every professional consultation he gave to a university board, every handshake he offered to a municipal developer, and every quiet, polite smile he flashed at those neighborhood safety meetings was a calculated tactical maneuver designed to secure his perimeter. He could never allow himself to form uncalculated personal relationships, and he could never speak without filtering his words through an internal matrix of self-preservation. The psychological toll of maintaining this degree of hypervigilance is catastrophic for the average human mind, but Vance's narcissism was so absolute that he viewed this deadly game of deception as a supreme testament to his own natural superiority over the entire justice system. The corporate defense team, recognizing that this behavioral testimony was sealing their client's historical legacy as an unredeemable monster and threatening their massive remaining property investments with total liquidation, launched a fierce, aggressive cross-examination. The lead estate attorney stepped forward, attempting to argue that Vance was suffering from an undiagnosed, severe obsessive-compulsive mapping disorder brought on by the immense professional stress and exhaustion of managing multi-million-dollar urban modernization projects during the late 90s. Is it not possible, Dr. Mercer, that an eccentric, highly focused engineer exposed to the chaotic, rapid expansion of a major metropolitan center could develop an extreme, pathological fixation on structural tracking as a desperate mental survival mechanism? The attorney demanded, his voice rising in an attempt to insert a clinical mitigating factor into the file. But Dr. Mercer remained entirely unshakable, his sharp gaze fixed on the defense table. There is a profound difference between a psychological fixation and an engineered system of human captivity, counselor, the doctor replied coldly. An individual suffering from a routine mapping disorder does not systematically access mainframe terminals at 3 a.m. to alter evidence tracking codes, nor do they maintain a handwritten manual to their victim's trophy safe for 27 years. This wasn't a break from reality. It was a highly organized, lifelong exploitation of reality. The afternoon session took a stunning turn when the prosecution introduced a final, devastating piece of physical evidence that had been recovered from the Peachtree Road property just 48 hours prior, hidden inside the hollow structural core of an old drafting table that Vance had donated to a local historical archive just months before his death in 2018. Inside the hidden metallic channel, federal forensic technicians had discovered Valerie's original, water-damaged wristwatch, the very silver timepiece that had been logged by her roommates on the night she vanished, an item that had completely escaped the notice of early investigators during the superficial walkthroughs of her townhouse. The state called to the stand retired property clerk Thomas Vance, who had managed the regional municipal infrastructure archiving facilities during the early 2000s. Vance, now an old man visibly shaken by his proximity to the historic horror, admitted under oath that Arthur Vance had frequently accessed the historical preservation vaults under the guise of an official civic safety inspection. He told us he was verifying the load-bearing capacities of the old building structures to ensure our archiving boxes wouldn't collapse during the digital migration, the clerk whispered, his voice trembling with a guilt that had waited decades for exposure. He looked so quiet, so authoritative, his identification credentials were flawless, and we were so overwhelmed by the sheer volume of New City data back then. I didn't think twice about leaving him alone in the historical blueprints vault for 20 minutes while I retrieved the master mapping sheets. To know now that I allowed him to utilize our space to monitor his tracks. It's a shame I will carry to my grave. The prosecution took the silver watch and displayed it on the presentation screen, showing that the internal hands of the mechanical movement had permanently frozen at exactly 2:22 a.m., the precise minute that the structural blunt force trauma from the heavy industrial wrench had shattered the crystal face inside the subterranean bunker. It was a spectacular, undeniable anchor to the moment of execution, a biological and mechanical voice from the dead that had traveled across nearly 3 decades inside the killer's own drafting table to condemn his memory. The state argued that Vance kept the watch not out of a sense of twisted remorse or human guilt, but as a sick, psychopathic token of his ultimate victory over the authorities, a physical reminder that he could walk into the city's highest design offices, sit at his drafting boards, and carry the trophy of his crime right past the eyes of the community without a single person questioning his power. As the judge ordered the evening adjournment, the legal commentators broadcasting from the courthouse steps noted that the state had effectively rested its case on a mountain of unassailable forensic, digital, and psychological truth. The corporate defense table sat silent as the federal prosecutors gathered their files, the legacy of Arthur Vance completely shattered by the day's behavioral revelations. The city of Atlanta, wrapped in the heavy, humid air of the July evening, stood on the precipice of a historic verdict, knowing that the ghost of Valerie Jenkins had finally stripped the consultant of his unearned respect, leaving his memory exposed to the absolute, unyielding vengeance of a truth that had finally broken through the concrete. The morning of July 15, 2026, witnessed an unprecedented gathering outside the Atlanta Federal Judicial Annex. A quiet, solemn crowd filled the public square, standing shoulder to shoulder under a gray, unyielding sky that seemed to mirror the heavy, historic finality descending upon courtroom 4A. Inside the chamber, the atmosphere had shifted from the analytical precision of the past days to a suffocating, almost theatrical tension as the trial against the estate of Arthur Vance moved into its penultimate phase, the closing arguments. The state had built an unassailable fortress of evidence, linking the digital ghost trail of the 20th century to the advanced geometric engineering of the 21st. Now, it was time for Assistant District Attorney Marcus Vance to deliver the final narrative arc that would weave these 27 years of horror, greed, and systemic institutional deception into a single, cohesive demand for absolute, sweeping justice. Vance stepped to the center of the courtroom floor, his posture immaculate, his gaze scanning the faces of the judicial panel who had sat through weeks of devastating, world-shattering testimony. He did not use digital screens or slide projections this morning. Instead, he stood before them with nothing but the raw, unadulterated power of the truth. For 27 years, this community lived under the shadow of an engineered ghost story. Vance began, his deep voice vibrating through the silent room, catching every ear in the gallery. Every citizen of Atlanta who drove past that Buckhead townhouse block or navigated the busy transit lines of Peachtree Road on a hot summer night looked at the dark and wondered what faceless predator could snatch a young woman from a safe zone without leaving a trace. We blamed the dense wood canopies of 1999. We blamed the primitive nature of early data tracking. We blamed a cruel, random world. But today, the light of modern subterranean radar and the unyielding march of justice have stripped away the illusion. The monster wasn't a stranger lurking in the bushes. The monster was checking his blueprints, wearing the most trusted architectural uniform of the state. The prosecutor walked slowly toward the defense table, stopping just 3 feet from where Vance's corporate estate executors and insurance lawyers sat hunched behind their mahogany desks, their folders filled with desperate financial shielding maneuvers. "Look at the paper trail he left behind," Vance commanded the panel, pointing a decisive finger at the digital evidence binders. He managed to live a long, quiet, comfortable life, passing away peacefully in 2018 while pretending to be an eccentric, harmless intellectual crushed by the weight of time and municipal bureaucracy. But do not let this final, historical camouflage continue to protect his assets. Inside that man's chest beat the heart of a master illusionist, a structural engineer who looked into the tear-filled eyes of Valerie Jenkins' aging parents during community safety meetings, offering his services, while secretly hiding her stolen student ID card inside a secondary subterranean trophy safe in North Georgia. He did not merely kill a 24-year-old medical researcher. He executed a corporate raid on the public trust. He used his freelance master key credentials to isolate his target. He used his industrial steel pipe wrench to completely crush her capacity for flight, and he spent nearly 3 decades climbing the administrative ladder of the city planning boards to ensure his own physical ghost remained buried beneath municipal red tape. Vance then systematically reviewed the absolute certainty of the physical and forensic assets the state had presented, building a chronological hammer blow that left no room for alternative explanations. He reminded the judicial panel of the macromolecular sequencing that matched the high-impact transfer cells embedded deep within the rubberized gasket seals of the bunker's ventilation intake motor directly to Vance's reference sample. He recalled the advanced 3D ballistic casting software that proved the bone fractures on the victim's skull possessed the precise, dual-ridged structural margins of an industrial wrench pulled from his own tool rack. He detailed the historical signal remastering that tracked Vance's personal white utility van as it stalked Valerie through the suburban cul-de-sac before remaining stationary at the Peachtree Road foundation for the exact hours required to mix and pour a secondary layer of high-strength concrete. The defense wants you to believe that this was a tragedy of circumstance, a chaotic anomaly, or the result of a severe, undiagnosed mapping disorder brought on by late 90s workplace stress. Vance continued, his voice rising with a controlled, righteous indignation that echoed off the high masonry walls. But an individual in a panic does not return to a facility mainframe terminal at 3 a.m. to manually mislabel underground storage blueprints. An individual in a panic does not systematically apply chemical acid burns to his own fingertips over a decade to confuse the early generations of automated fingerprint registries. An individual in a panic does not walk into a municipal archiving vault, manipulate a junior clerk, and rob a cold case file of the victim's shattered wristwatch to keep as a sick, psychopathic trophy inside his custom-machined drafting tables. This was an authoritative execution. It was a cold-blooded, lifelong exploitation of public infrastructure access designed to afford the consultant a career of unearned prestige while his victim was entombed in the masonry of his basement workshop. The courtroom remained completely paralyzed, the silence so absolute that the distant rush of the morning rain against the reinforced glass sounded like a low, continuous growl. When Vance finally concluded his address, asking the panel to return a definitive judgment of liability and order the total, sweeping forfeiture of all global assets tied to the Vance estate, including his properties, investment portfolios, and legacy corporate holdings, several members of the panel were visibly nodding, their expressions hardened by the overwhelming weight of the truth. The prosecutor walked back to his table, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in his wake, a void that the estate's legal defense team now had to enter with the impossible task of defending a 27-year-old lie. The lead defense counsel stepped forward, his expression weary but intensely focused, launching into a desperate, financially charged final appeal that attempted to exploit the themes of architectural complexity and the vast passage of time. He argued that the state's case, while technologically brilliant, was built entirely on circumstantial electronic reconstructions and advanced digital modeling that didn't even exist when the consultant was actively designing city projects. He tried to paint Vance not as a calculating monster, but as a deeply eccentric, hyper-focused public servant whose legacy was being unfairly dismantled by modern revisionist forensics, suggesting that the DNA findings were the result of systemic evidence vault cross-contamination during the laboratory migrations of the late 2000s. Look at the structural contributions my client made to this city for nearly 4 decades, the attorney pleaded, his voice echoing through the silent room. He protected our historical preservation zones, he verified our utility foundations, and he supported our public libraries. Is that the behavior of a serial predator? You cannot dismantle a decorated engineering legacy and seize millions in corporate assets based on microscopic genetic material pulled from a basement floor after half a century. But the defense's financial protection arguments felt hollow, like dry paper scraping against the stone floor of the annex, completely incapable of standing against the concrete reality of the state's forensic architecture. The state's rebuttal was swift, clinical, and devastating. Marcus Vance stood up one final time, holding Valerie's shattered silver wristwatch in his open palm, the frozen hands still pointing directly at 2:22 a.m. Professional prestige paid for with the stolen life and total isolation of Valerie Jenkins is not a legacy, Vance whispered, looking directly into the eyes of the panel. It is the ultimate act of concealment. The clock stopped for Valerie 27 years ago in the darkness of that Peachtree Road bunker. It is time for the law to start ticking again. With those final words, the judge formally closed the evidentiary presentation, instructing the judicial panel on the legal definitions of premeditated structural camouflage, authoritative exploitation, and absolute forensic certainty before ordering them to retire to the inner chambers to determine the final liability of the Arthur Vance estate. As the panel files marched out of the room, the security detail moved to secure the physical exhibits, leaving the corporate executors sitting in a heavy, silent vacuum. The city of Atlanta, wrapped in the quiet anticipation of the July afternoon, held its breath, knowing that the longest run from justice in the modern engineering corridors of Georgia was finally coming to its absolute, inevitable end.